There is something about the night that invites honesty. When the world grows quiet and the distractions of daylight fade into shadow, we find ourselves alone with thoughts we've been avoiding all day long. It is in these hours that we meet ourselves most truly, stripped of pretense and performance, facing the raw interior of our own consciousness. This is the territory that Fyodor Dostoevsky understood better than perhaps any writer who has ever lived. He was a cartographer of the human soul at midnight, mapping the terrain where guilt meets grace, where despair touches something that might be called redemption, where the deepest darkness becomes strangely inseparable from the possibility of light. Dostoevsky lived much of his life in the night of the soul. Born in Moscow in 1821, he entered a world that would test him in ways most people never experience. His childhood was marked by a strict father and an atmosphere of religious devotion mixed with domestic tension. When he was just 15 years old, his mother died, and 3 years later, his father was murdered by his own serfs in a brutal act that would haunt Dostoevsky forever. These early encounters with death and violence planted seeds that would later bloom into his profound explorations of guilt, suffering, and moral responsibility. He was a young man who learned early that life is not gentle, that the human heart contains capacities for both unspeakable cruelty and transcendent love, often existing side by side within the same person. In his 20s, Dostoevsky became involved in radical political circles, attending meetings where forbidden ideas about social reform and revolution were discussed in whispered tones. This was dangerous work in the authoritarian Russia of Nicholas I, and eventually Dostoevsky and his fellow conspirators were arrested. What followed was an experience that would fundamentally reshape his understanding of existence itself. He was sentenced to death by firing squad. On a freezing December morning in 1849, he was led out with other prisoners to Semyonovsky Square, where the execution was to take place. They were dressed in white death shirts. The first group of men was tied to posts. Dostoevsky was in the second group, watching, knowing he would be next. And then, at the very last moment, a messenger arrived with news that the Tsar had commuted their sentences. The execution had been a staged psychological torture, designed to break them before sending them to Siberian labor camps instead. Imagine standing before a firing squad, having made peace with the end of your existence, only to be pulled back into life at the final instant. This experience marked Dostoevsky indelibly. He would later write that those moments contained an eternity, that when you truly face death, every second becomes precious beyond measure, filled with a clarity that ordinary life never achieves. Time itself transforms when you stand at its edge. This encounter with mortality gave Dostoevsky what might be called a double vision of existence. He saw life from the perspective of someone who had already died and been resurrected, someone who could no longer take a single breath for granted. Everything became simultaneously more terrible and more beautiful, more painful and more sacred. The years he spent in the Siberian prison camp were brutal beyond description. He performed hard labor in sub-zero temperatures, lived among murderers and thieves, endured floggings and deprivation that would have destroyed most people. And yet, something strange happened in that darkness. He began to see the humanity in the criminals around him, to understand that even the most degraded person contains something irreducible, some spark that no amount of suffering can fully extinguish. He witnessed acts of kindness in the midst of horror, saw men share their last crust of bread, watched as prisoners who had committed unspeakable crimes nevertheless retained a capacity for tenderness. This paradox became central to his philosophy. Human beings are not simply good or evil, rational or irrational, saved or damned. They are infinitely complex, containing multitudes that contradict themselves moment by moment. The prison became for Dostoevsky a laboratory of the human condition, a place where the masks of civilization fell away and he could observe the soul in its most naked and essential state. When he finally returned from Siberia after serving his full sentence and then spending years as a soldier in enforced military service, Dostoevsky was a changed man. He had left as a young radical who believed in rationalist solutions to human problems, and he returned with a profound skepticism about human reason and a deep, complicated faith in something beyond logic. He no longer believed that social engineering or political revolution could save humanity, because he had seen that the problems of the human heart run far deeper than any political system. The darkness he had witnessed was not simply a product of bad institutions or ignorance that could be educated away. It was something woven into the fabric of human freedom itself. We are creatures who can choose evil even when we know it is evil, who can destroy ourselves and others not out of ignorance, but out of something more mysterious and troubling. This is the paradox that would haunt all of his greatest works. Dostoevsky's major novels are not really novels in the conventional sense. They are philosophical investigations disguised as stories, psychological expeditions into the interior landscapes of human consciousness. He was not interested in describing the external world with the kind of realism that his contemporary Tolstoy mastered so brilliantly. Dostoevsky's realism was of a different kind entirely. He wanted to capture the actual texture of thought itself, the way consciousness moves and doubles back on itself, the way we argue with ourselves, justify our actions, construct elaborate rationalizations, and then suddenly break down under the weight of truth. His characters think in the same tortured, circular, contradictory ways that real people think when they are alone with themselves at 3 in the morning. They are not simplified types, but living consciousnesses, each one containing a whole universe of conflicting impulses and ideas. The themes that run through his work like dark threads are suffering, guilt, freedom, faith, and redemption. These are not abstract concepts for Dostoevsky, but lived realities, experiences that burn through the soul and leave it transformed. He understood suffering not as something to be avoided at all costs, but as an essential part of the human journey, a kind of refining fire that can either destroy us or purify us, depending on how we meet it. He saw guilt not as a neurotic symptom to be cured, but as the voice of conscience, the sign that we still possess a moral sense, that we have not yet become completely dead inside. Freedom, for him, was the most terrifying and precious thing humans possess, because with freedom comes responsibility, and with responsibility comes the unbearable weight of our choices. Faith was not a comfortable certainty, but a leap through darkness, a gamble made when reason has exhausted itself and something else must carry us forward. And redemption was always possible, even for the worst sinner, but never easy, never cheap, always requiring a kind of death and rebirth of the self. What makes Dostoevsky so powerful, even now, more than a century after his death, is that he speaks directly to the experience of being human in ways that feel utterly contemporary. He anticipated so much of what would later be called existentialism, psychoanalysis, and phenomenology. He understood the underground man who cannot act because he is too conscious, paralyzed by his own awareness of all the contradictions and complications of every choice. He grasped the way guilt works on the psyche, eating away at us from within, until confession becomes the only path to peace, even if that confession leads to punishment. He saw how ideologies, even beautiful-sounding ones about human perfectibility and rational progress, can become prisons that deny the messy, irrational, miraculous reality of actual human existence. He knew that people do not want only happiness and comfort, but also meaning, even if that meaning requires suffering, even if it demands everything from us. There is a darkness in Dostoevsky's work that can be overwhelming. His novels contain murders and suicides, scenes of degradation and cruelty that can be hard to bear. He does not look away from the worst that humans can do to each other and to themselves. But here is what matters, what makes his darkness different from mere pessimism or nihilism. Dostoevsky descends into hell not to stay there, but to find the path through it. He explores the depths, not because he loves darkness, but because he believes that only by fully acknowledging the darkness can we find authentic light. He is not interested in easy consolations or shallow optimism. He wants to know what remains when everything has been stripped away, when all illusions have been shattered, when we have faced the very worst about ourselves and the world. And what he finds there, again and again, is that even in the deepest darkness, love remains possible. Forgiveness remains possible. Transformation remains possible. Not because everything works out neatly or because suffering is rewarded, but because human beings possess a mysterious capacity to transcend themselves, to choose compassion even when compassion seems absurd, to believe in meaning even when meaning seems to have collapsed. As you settle into these ideas, as you allow yourself to drift through the landscape of Dostoevsky's thought, you might notice how his questions become your questions. What does it mean to be free? How do we live with the weight of our choices? Is suffering meaningless, or can it teach us something essential? What remains when everything else falls away? These are not questions that have simple answers. They are questions that each person must live through for themselves. Dostoevsky does not offer solutions so much as he offers companionship in the questioning. He walks with us through the dark valleys, acknowledging the difficulty of it all, never pretending that life is easier or simpler than it actually is. And there is something deeply comforting in that honesty, something that allows us to relax into the complexity of our own existence without needing to resolve it all right now. His philosophy, if we can even call it that, is not systematic. He did not build elaborate logical structures or write academic treatises. Instead, he embodied his ideas in characters who live and breathe and struggle, who make terrible mistakes and seek redemption, who doubt and believe and doubt again. Through their journeys, we see aspects of ourselves reflected back, our own contradictions and longings made visible. The Underground Man shows us what happens when consciousness turns against itself. Raskolnikov shows us the psychological cost of transgression and the surprising grace of confession. The Karamazov brothers show us the different parts of our own soul in conversation with each other, the rational, the faithful, and the passionate elements all contending for dominance. Ivan asks the hardest questions about God and suffering. Alyosha offers love as a response that does not answer the questions, but somehow makes them bearable. Dmitri embodies the chaotic energy of life itself, capable of both tremendous vice and tremendous virtue. To read Dostoevsky, or in this case, to listen to his ideas unfold slowly in the quiet of night, is to enter a space where the usual defenses we maintain during the day begin to dissolve. We become more honest with ourselves about our own capacity for both darkness and light. We recognize that we too contain contradictions, that we too struggle with questions that have no easy answers. And in that recognition, there can be a strange kind of peace. Not the peace of resolution, but the peace of acknowledgement. We are what we are, complicated and contradictory, capable of terrible things and beautiful things, stumbling through existence trying to find our way. Dostoevsky saw all of that and did not turn away. He looked directly at the human condition in all its difficulty and said, yes, this is what it means to be alive, and even so, even with all the suffering and confusion, there is something here worth affirming, something sacred in the struggle itself. So as you begin this journey through Dostoevsky's thought, allow yourself to settle into the rhythm of these ideas. There is no need to grasp everything immediately or to arrive at conclusions. Simply let the themes wash over you, let them resonate with your own experience in whatever way feels natural. We will explore suffering and how it can lead to wisdom. We will descend into the underground of consciousness and see what lurks there. We will walk with Raskolnikov through his crime and toward his redemption. We will sit with the Karamazov brothers and listen to their arguments about faith and doubt. We will face the problem of innocent suffering and ask whether life can be justified. We will consider what it means to believe when reason offers no certainty. And through it all, we will trace the contours of a philosophy that is less about answers and more about the courage to keep asking questions, to keep seeking, to keep believing that even in the darkest night, dawn eventually comes. Dostoevsky's darkness was never the final word. It was only ever the necessary passage through which light becomes real and not just wishful thinking. He insisted on looking at everything, hiding nothing, denying nothing, and then, having seen the worst, choosing love anyway. That is the heart of his philosophy, that simple and difficult truth. We cannot skip over the darkness. We cannot pretend it does not exist. But we also need not be destroyed by it. We can walk through it and emerge transformed, carrying the scars, but also carrying a deeper understanding of what it means to be human, what it means to suffer and endure, and forgive and hope. This is the night mind of Dostoevsky, this willingness to descend into the depths so that the ascent, when it comes, is earned and authentic and true. Suffering is universal, yet each person's suffering feels absolutely unique. This is one of the first things we must understand when we enter Dostoevsky's world. He did not write about suffering as an abstract philosophical problem, but as a lived reality, something experienced in the body and in the soul, something that transforms us whether we choose it or not. For Dostoevsky, suffering was not primarily a question to be answered, but a territory to be explored, mapped, and understood from the inside. He knew suffering intimately. He had felt the lash on his back in Siberia. He had watched his first wife die slowly and painfully from tuberculosis. He had lost his beloved brother and his infant son. He had struggled with epilepsy his entire adult life, experiencing seizures that left him shattered and disoriented. He had known poverty so extreme that he often did not know where his next meal would come from. And beyond all of this physical and circumstantial suffering, He endured the internal torments of a sensitive and overactive consciousness, the endless self-examination and guilt that characterize the underground man and so many of his greatest characters. But what separates Dostoevsky from mere pessimism or despair is his conviction that suffering serves a purpose in the economy of the soul. This is not to say that suffering is good, or that we should seek it out or inflict it on others. He was not a masochist or a sadist. Rather, he observed something that goes against our modern instinct to avoid pain at all costs. He noticed that suffering has the peculiar ability to awaken us from the sleep of comfortable illusion. When everything is going well, when life is smooth and pleasant, we tend to live on the surface of ourselves. We go through the motions, play our roles, think the expected thoughts, and never really question the meaning of it all. But when suffering crashes into our lives, when we lose someone we love, or face our own mortality, or endure betrayal or failure, suddenly we are forced to go deeper. The comfortable assumptions fall away. We can no longer hide from the fundamental questions. What matters? What is real? Who am I when everything I thought defined me has been stripped away? This awakening through suffering is one of Dostoevsky's central insights. In Notes from Underground, his short but devastating masterpiece, we meet a character who suffers from an excess of consciousness. The underground man is isolated, bitter, and resentful, unable to act or connect with others because he is too aware of all the contradictions and humiliations involved in human interaction. He is paralyzed by his own intelligence, trapped in a cycle of thinking and overthinking that prevents him from actually living. And yet, despite his obvious misery, he clings to his suffering as the one thing that proves he is more than just a mechanical being following rational laws. He suffers, therefore he is free. He suffers, therefore he is human. His rant against the rationalists of his day, who believed that human beings would behave perfectly if only they understood their own self-interest correctly, is one of the great polemics in literature. The underground man insists that people do not want only pleasure and advantage. Sometimes they want to suffer. Sometimes they want to assert their will, even against their own interest, just to prove they are not piano keys being played by the laws of nature and logic. This seems like a strange thing to say, and on first encounter it can sound almost perverse. Why would anyone want to suffer? But if we are honest with ourselves, we recognize the truth in it. How often do we choose the harder path, not because it will make us happier, but because it feels more authentic, more meaningful? How often do we refuse to compromise on something even when compromise would be easier, simply because we need to assert our autonomy, our sense that we are agents and not just passive recipients of circumstance? The underground man, in his twisted and exaggerated way, is showing us something real about human nature. We are not purely rational creatures seeking maximum pleasure and minimum pain. We are creatures who need meaning, and sometimes meaning requires suffering, requires struggle, requires going against what would be comfortable or convenient. Dostoevsky develops this theme much more fully in Crime and Punishment, perhaps his most perfectly constructed novel. The protagonist, Rodion Raskolnikov, is a young student living in desperate poverty in St. Petersburg. He conceives an idea that certain extraordinary people who contribute something significant to human progress, are entitled to step over conventional moral boundaries. They can commit crimes if those crimes serve a greater good. He thinks of Napoleon, who caused immense suffering but also reshaped history. Using this logic, Raskolnikov decides to murder a pawnbroker, an old woman who he tells himself is worthless, a louse preying on the desperate poor. He will kill her, take her money, and use it to complete his education and do good in the world. The utilitarian calculus seems to work out. One worthless life ended, many other lives improved, and besides, he will prove to himself that he is one of the extraordinary people, someone capable of stepping beyond the ordinary moral limitations that bind mediocre souls. But from the moment Raskolnikov commits the murder, something begins to happen to him that he did not anticipate. He thought he could kill and remain untouched, that his rational justification would protect him from guilt. Instead, he finds himself falling apart. The suffering that follows the crime is not primarily external. Yes, there is the detective Porphyry who suspects him and slowly closes in. Yes, there is the practical danger of being caught and punished. But the real torture is internal. Raskolnikov is haunted by what he has done. He cannot eat, cannot sleep, falls into feverish delirium, alienates everyone who cares about him. His consciousness becomes a prison more terrible than any physical cell, and what makes it unbearable is that he cannot confess, cannot seek forgiveness. because he is still clinging to his theory, still trying to prove to himself that he was right to do what he did. He is caught between his need to justify himself and his growing awareness that he has done something unforgivable. What Dostoevsky shows us through Raskolnikov's suffering is the inescapable reality of conscience. We cannot simply reason away our moral sense. We cannot convince ourselves that what feels like a transgression is actually permissible just because we have a clever theory. The guilt emerges from somewhere deeper than rational thought, from some fundamental level of our being that recognizes the sacred value of human life, even the life of a difficult old pawnbroker. Raskolnikov wanted to prove he was extraordinary, beyond good and evil, but instead he discovers that he is all too human, bound by the same moral architecture as everyone else. And his suffering, while terrible, is also the sign of his humanity. If he could kill without remorse, if he could step over that boundary and feel nothing, then he would truly be a monster, less than human rather than more. His suffering is paradoxically what saves him, because it proves that something in him still recognizes the truth. The novel moves toward redemption, but it is a slow and painful process. Raskolnikov eventually confesses, not because the evidence against him has become overwhelming, but because he cannot bear the internal torment any longer. And the person who guides him toward this confession is Sonia, a young woman forced into prostitution to support her desperate family. Sonia is one of Dostoevsky's most luminous characters, someone who embodies a kind of pure compassion that persists despite degradation and suffering. She does not judge Raskolnikov. She does not recoil from him when he tells her what he has done. Instead, she weeps for him and tells him that he must confess, must accept his suffering as the path to redemption. She gives him a cross to wear and promises to follow him to Siberia, to stand by him through his punishment. And in one of the most powerful scenes in all of literature, she reads to him the story of Lazarus from the Gospel of John, the story of a man who was dead and was raised to life. The implication is clear. Raskolnikov too is dead, his soul dead even though his body lives, and only through suffering and faith can he be resurrected into life again. What Dostoevsky is exploring here is the connection between suffering and transformation. Raskolnikov's punishment is not primarily the years he will spend in the labor camp in Siberia. That is just the external consequence of his crime. His real punishment and his real redemption happens in the slow work of confronting what he has done and allowing it to change him. In the epilogue of the novel, we see Raskolnikov in Siberia, still struggling, still not fully transformed. But something has begun to shift in him. Through Sonia's patient love and through his own suffering, he is beginning to feel again, to reconnect with his humanity, to see other people as real rather than as abstractions to be calculated and manipulated. The process is incomplete, but it has begun. And Dostoevsky leaves us with the sense that this process, however long it takes, is the only real path forward. We cannot escape our transgressions through clever reasoning or by running away. We can only move through them by facing them fully, by suffering their consequences, by allowing the suffering to crack open our hardened hearts and make us capable of love again. This pattern recurs throughout Dostoevsky's work. Characters suffer, resist the suffering, try to justify themselves, and then finally break down and allow the suffering to teach them something. The suffering is never gratuitous. It always serves the purpose of stripping away false selves and false ideas, revealing the truth beneath. And the truth is almost always that we are more fragile, more dependent on others, more in need of grace than we wanted to admit. The proud man who thinks he can stand alone discovers that he needs community. The rational man who thinks he can figure everything out discovers that reason has limits and something else must carry him forward. The person who thinks they are beyond conventional morality discovers that conscience is real and cannot be abolished by theory. There is a scene in Crime and Punishment that captures this beautifully. After the murder, Raskolnikov encounters a drunk man who has been hit by a carriage. The man is dying in the street and people are gathered around, not sure what to do. Raskolnikov, despite his own torment, spends his last few coins to help get the man to his home. He does this instinctively, without thinking about it, and later he cannot understand why he did it. It contradicts everything he has been telling himself about extraordinary people being above conventional morality, and yet he could not help himself. In that moment, his natural compassion asserted itself despite his theories. This is what Dostoevsky wants us to see. Our theories, our rationalizations, our attempts to justify ourselves are always secondary to something more fundamental in our nature. We are creatures capable of spontaneous compassion. We are moved by suffering, both our own and that of others. And this capacity to be moved, to feel, to care, is more trustworthy than any abstract philosophy. The paradox that Dostoevsky explores again and again is that suffering, while horrible and something we naturally want to avoid, can lead to wisdom and compassion that no other path can provide. The person who has never suffered remains on the surface of life, never understanding the depths. But the person who has descended into the darkness and emerged again carries a quality of soul that cannot be acquired any other way. They know what it means to be broken. They know what it means to need help. They know what it means to be forgiven. And because they know these things through lived experience rather than abstract knowledge, they become capable of genuine compassion for others who are suffering. They can sit with another person in pain without needing to fix it immediately or explain it away. They can be present to suffering without being destroyed by it, because they have learned that suffering is not the end of the story. This does not mean that Dostoevsky glorifies suffering or thinks we should seek it out. He is not advocating for a masochistic spirituality that inflicts pain on itself. Rather, he is recognizing the reality that suffering comes to all of us, whether we want it or not. And the question is, what we do with it when it arrives. Do we become bitter and resentful, blaming the world or God or other people for our pain? Do we numb ourselves with distractions and addictions, trying to avoid feeling anything at all? Or do we allow the suffering to open us, to deepen us, to connect us more fully with our own humanity and the humanity of others? This is the choice that his characters face, and it is the choice that each of us faces in our own lives. Suffering is inevitable. What is not inevitable is what the suffering makes of us. It can destroy us or refine us, harden us or soften us, isolate us or connect us to others. The outcome depends on how we meet it. There is something profoundly comforting in this view. Even though it does not offer easy consolation, Dostoevsky is not telling us that everything happens for a reason, or that suffering is secretly good, or that it will all work out in the end. He is simply observing that suffering can be a teacher if we let it be, that the depths of pain can reveal depths of soul we did not know we possessed. And in a strange way, this makes suffering more bearable. If we know that our pain is not meaningless, that it might be working some hidden transformation in us, then we can endure it with more patience and grace. We do not have to pretend it is not happening or that it does not hurt. We can acknowledge the reality of it fully, while also trusting that we are being changed by it in ways we cannot yet see. As you let these ideas settle into your consciousness, as you allow yourself to reflect on your own relationship with suffering, you might notice that Dostoevsky's vision feels true in a way that more cheerful philosophies do not. He is not selling false hope or easy answers. He is simply walking with us through the valley of shadows and pointing out that even here, even in the darkest places, something real and valuable can be found. The person who has suffered deeply and honestly knows things that the comfortable person can never know. They have touched something essential about what it means to be human, and that knowledge, while purchased at a terrible price, is a kind of treasure. It cannot be taken away once it is earned. It changes how we see everything, and it makes us capable of a deeper, more authentic form of love, a love that can embrace brokenness rather than demanding perfection, a love that can sit with pain rather than rushing to eliminate it. There is a peculiar kind of suffering that comes not from external circumstances, but from consciousness itself. This is the territory that Dostoevsky explores in Notes from Underground, a short novel that reads more like a philosophical confession than a traditional story. The narrator, known simply as the Underground Man, is perhaps one of the most difficult characters in all of literature. He is bitter, resentful, self-contradictory, and often cruel. He cannot maintain relationships. He cannot act decisively. He spends most of his time alone in his shabby room, thinking and overthinking, analyzing and reanalyzing, until thought itself becomes a kind of paralysis. And yet, despite how unpleasant he is, there is something uncomfortably recognizable about him. He speaks to a condition that many people, especially in the modern world, know intimately. He is the voice of alienation, of too much consciousness, of the self watching itself so closely that spontaneous action becomes impossible. The Underground Man begins his confession with a declaration. He is a sick man, he tells us, a spiteful man, an unattractive man. He believes his liver is diseased. He refuses to see a doctor out of spite, even though he respects medicine. Right from the beginning, we are in the presence of someone who is at war with himself, who cannot do the reasonable thing, even when he knows what the reasonable thing is. This is his defining characteristic. He is too conscious, too aware of all the layers of motivation and social performance involved in every action. When other people do something, they just do it. But the underground man cannot. He must first think about why he is doing it, and then think about whether his reasons are genuine or merely self-deception, and then think about how others will perceive his action, and then think about whether he cares how others perceive it, and so on in endless spirals until the moment for action has passed and he is left alone with his thoughts once again. He is writing his confession in opposition to the fashionable ideas of his time, the mid-19th century, when there was great optimism about human progress and rationality. The intellectuals of his day believed that once people understood the laws of nature and society, once they grasped their own rational self-interest, they would naturally behave well. Suffering and evil were seen as the result of ignorance and bad social organization. Fix the external conditions, educate people properly, and paradise would follow. The underground man finds this vision not just wrong, but insultingly naive. It treats human beings as if they were mathematical entities, as if you could predict and control human behavior through rational calculation. And his entire confession is an extended argument against this view. He wants to show that human beings are far stranger, far more contradictory, and far more essentially irrational than the progressive thinkers will admit. His central example is suffering itself. If human beings were truly rational creatures seeking only pleasure and advantage, then suffering would always be avoided. But the underground man observes that people often choose to suffer. They cling to their resentments even when letting go would make them happier. They refuse to compromise, even when compromise is obviously in their interest. They sabotage their own success. They pick fights they cannot win. They nurse grievances that poison their own lives. Why? Not because they are ignorant or mistaken about what would be good for them, but because something in human nature rebels against being too predictable, too controlled, too much like a rational machine. The underground man argues that sometimes people want to suffer just to prove that they are free, that they are not merely piano keys being played by the laws of nature and necessity. Even if it is irrational, even if it hurts, the assertion of will, the refusal to be calculated and predicted, feels essential to maintaining one's humanity. This is a deeply uncomfortable insight because it suggests that the problem of human suffering cannot be solved by better organization or more education. If people sometimes choose suffering as a way of asserting their freedom, then no amount of external improvement will eliminate suffering from human life. And this goes against our modern instinct to believe that every problem has a solution, that suffering is always the result of something fixable. The underground man is saying that some suffering comes from the very structure of human consciousness itself, from our strange and paradoxical nature as free beings who are also aware of our freedom, who must choose how to live even though there is no objective criterion for making that choice. We are burdened with a kind of existential weight that no perfect society can lift. The first part of Notes from Underground is all philosophical ranting, the underground man arguing with the rationalists and progressives, tearing apart their optimistic visions. But the second part is a story, a memory from his younger days. And this is where we see the human cost of his excessive consciousness. He tells the story of how he once forced his way into a gathering of former schoolmates who did not want him there. How he behaved awkwardly and resentfully, making everyone uncomfortable. He then tells of his encounter with a young prostitute named Liza. After visiting her in the brothel, he delivers a speech about how degraded her life is and how she should leave prostitution and live differently. He is eloquent and passionate, and she is moved by his words. She comes to visit him a few days later, hoping perhaps to find the compassionate person who spoke to her so powerfully. But when she arrives, she finds the underground man in a completely different mood, humiliated and angry about something unrelated. Unable to maintain the noble persona he presented at the brothel, he turns cruel. He hurts her deliberately, lashing out to reassert some sense of control. When she finally understands what kind of person he really is, she pities him and forgives him, which only makes him feel worse. He presses money into her hand as she leaves, turning their interaction into just another financial transaction, reducing her again to the role he claimed he wanted to save her from. This encounter with Liza is devastating because it shows the underground man's complete inability to sustain genuine human connection. He is capable of eloquent speeches about how people should live, but when faced with an actual person reaching out to him, he cannot respond with simple kindness. His self-consciousness gets in the way. He is thinking too much about what everything means, about how he appears, about his own humiliation. And these thoughts crowd out the possibility of genuine feeling and genuine response. He knows this about himself. He understands that he is sabotaging his own life. But understanding does not help. Knowledge of the problem is not the same as the ability to overcome it. This is perhaps the most hopeless aspect of the underground man's condition. He has perfect insight into his own flaws, but no power to change them. Consciousness, which was supposed to be humanity's great advantage, has become his trap. What Dostoevsky is exploring through this character is a problem that would later be called radical self-consciousness or hyper-reflexivity in existentialist and phenomenological philosophy. When we become too aware of ourselves, when we watch ourselves too closely, we lose the ability to act naturally and spontaneously. Everything becomes a performance. Even when we are alone, we become alienated from our own immediate experience, always thinking about our thinking, always analyzing our feelings instead of simply feeling them. The underground man describes how a normal person, an active person, can be insulted and immediately respond with anger or with some appropriate action. But the overly conscious person cannot. They must first think about whether the insult was really an insult and whether their anger is justified, and whether responding would make them look foolish, and so on, until the moment has passed and they are left with nothing but impotent resentment. They have thought themselves out of the ability to live. This condition is both comic and tragic. The underground man is often ridiculous, and Dostoevsky does not shy away from showing us his pettiness and absurdity. But there is also something genuinely painful about his predicament. He is trapped in a hell of his own making, a prisoner of his own mind. And while his condition is extreme, many of us recognize aspects of it in ourselves. How often do we overthink social interactions, replaying conversations in our heads, worrying about how we came across? How often does our awareness of ourselves get in the way of simply being ourselves? How often do we analyze our feelings so much that we lose touch with what we actually feel? The underground man is an exaggerated version of a tendency that exists in all of us to some degree, especially in modern culture where we are constantly encouraged to be self-aware, to monitor ourselves, to optimize and improve every aspect of our lives. This endless self-monitoring can become its own form of suffering. The underground man also represents a critique of pure rationalism, of the belief that reason alone can guide us to the good life. He demonstrates that reason, when divorced from feeling and intuition, when pushed to extremes, becomes destructive. He can reason about everything, justify anything, but he cannot live well because living well requires more than reason. It requires the ability to act without perfect knowledge, to trust one's instincts, to connect with others at a level deeper than rational calculation. The rationalists of his day believed that enlightened self-interest would lead people to cooperate and create harmonious societies. But the underground man shows us that self-interest itself is not a simple, calculable thing. What do we really want? What is really in our interest? These questions do not have straightforward answers because human beings want contradictory things. We want security, but also adventure. We want belonging, but also autonomy. We want to be understood, but we also want to maintain mystery. We want happiness, but we also want meaning, even when meaning requires suffering. This insight connects to one of Dostoevsky's deepest convictions, which is that human freedom is both our greatest gift and our heaviest burden. We are not like other animals who have clear instincts guiding them. We must choose how to live, and every choice forecloses other possibilities. This is terrifying. The underground man, in his excessive consciousness, feels this terror more acutely than most people. He sees too clearly that there is no objective ground for his choices, no way to be certain he is doing the right thing. And so he becomes paralyzed, unable to commit to any course of action, because he can always see the arguments on the other side. He is free, but cannot bear the weight of his freedom. He wants someone or something to tell him definitively what to do. But he also rebels against any authority that tries to limit his freedom. He is caught in an impossible bind. Dostoevsky wrote Notes from Underground, partly as a response to a novel by Chernyshevsky called What is to be Done, which presented a utopian vision of rational people living in perfect harmony through enlightened self-interest. The underground man is Dostoevsky's answer to that vision. He is saying, look, here is what human consciousness is actually like. Here is what happens when you take rationalism to its logical conclusion. You do not get harmonious cooperation. You get isolation, resentment, and paralysis. The utopian dreamers are missing something essential about human nature. They want to build a crystal palace, a perfect society based on scientific principles, where everything is organized rationally and everyone is happy. But the underground man says he would rather stick out his tongue at that crystal palace, would rather smash it, because a world without suffering, without irrationality, without the ability to rebel and assert one's will even against one's own interest, would be a world that denies something essential about what it means to be human. This does not mean that Dostoevsky is celebrating the underground man's condition. The novel is not saying that we should aspire to be like him. On the contrary, the underground man is miserable, and his misery is largely self-inflicted. But Dostoevsky is using him to expose the limitations of purely rationalist approaches to human life. The underground man represents what happens when consciousness becomes too detached from life, when thinking replaces living. He is a cautionary figure, showing us what we must avoid. And yet he also contains within his very suffering a kind of truth. His refusal to accept easy answers, his insistence on acknowledging the full complexity and contradictoriness of human nature, his rebellion against systems that would reduce people to predictable units, all of this has value, even if the way he lives it out is destructive. The tragedy of the underground man is that he cannot find a way out of his predicament. Unlike Raskolnikov, who moves toward redemption, the underground man remains stuck. The novel ends with him still underground, still alone, still bitter. He acknowledges that he has been writing for an imaginary audience, that even his confession is a kind of performance, another layer of self-conscious posturing. He cannot escape himself. And in this sense, Notes from Underground is Dostoevsky's darkest work because it presents a problem without offering a solution. The underground man shows us a condition that reason alone cannot fix, that conscious effort alone cannot overcome. He needs grace. He needs love. He needs some force from outside himself to break through the walls of his self-consciousness. But these things do not come to him, and the novel leaves him trapped. Yet there is something important even in this darkness, this depiction of a seemingly hopeless condition. Dostoevsky is acknowledging that some forms of suffering, particularly the suffering that comes from being too much inside one's own head, do not have easy answers. You cannot think your way out of overthinking. You cannot use consciousness to escape the trap of consciousness. What is needed is something else, something more like grace, or love, or faith, or simple spontaneous action that does not pass through the filter of self-awareness. But these things cannot be willed into existence. They must come unbidden, must catch us by surprise, must arrive as gifts rather than achievements. The underground man cannot give these things to himself, and no one else appears in his life to give them to him, and so he remains underground. This raises profound questions about the limits of individual effort and the need for connection with others. The underground man's fundamental problem is his isolation. He has cut himself off from genuine relationship. He sees every interaction as a potential source of humiliation or a stage for performance. He cannot simply be with another person without all his defenses and calculations getting in the way. And this isolation feeds on itself. The more alone he is, the more he retreats into his own thoughts. The more he retreats into his own thoughts, the harder it becomes to connect with anyone. He is caught in a vicious cycle that he cannot break on his own. What he needs is for someone to reach him despite his defenses, to love him despite his unlovableness, to persist in caring for him even when he pushes them away. But this kind of grace does not arrive in his story. When we contrast the underground man with characters like Sonia in Crime and Punishment, or Alyosha in The Brothers Karamazov, we see what he is missing. These characters possess a quality that the underground man completely lacks. They are able to act spontaneously, to love without calculation, to be present to others without the constant self-monitoring that paralyzes the underground man. They are conscious, certainly, but their consciousness does not separate them from life. Instead, it allows them to perceive more deeply, to respond more compassionately. They represent a different possibility, a way of being conscious that enhances rather than destroys one's ability to live. The underground man shows us what consciousness becomes when it is cut off from faith, from love, from connection with others. It becomes a prison, a hell of endless self-reflection with no way out. As we sit with these ideas, as we allow ourselves to feel the claustrophobia of the underground man's existence, we might recognize moments in our own lives when we have felt similarly trapped. Times when we have overthought things to the point of paralysis. Times when our self-awareness has gotten in the way of simple, spontaneous joy or connection. times when we have analyzed ourselves so thoroughly that we have lost touch with who we actually are beneath all the analysis. The underground man, in his extremity, shows us these tendencies magnified, and in seeing them so clearly, we might become more aware of them in ourselves and more motivated to resist them. The way out of the underground, though Dostoevsky does not show it in this particular novel, involves somehow recovering the ability to trust life, to act without perfect certainty, to open oneself to others despite the risk of humiliation. It involves accepting that we cannot control everything, cannot understand everything, cannot protect ourselves from all possible suffering. It involves a kind of surrender, a willingness to be vulnerable, to be wrong, to be foolish, if that is what genuine living requires. The underground man cannot make this surrender. He is too afraid, too proud, too locked inside his own defenses. But other characters in Dostoevsky's universe can and do make it, and through them we see the possibility of a different way of being. The illusion of control that the underground man clings to is ultimately what destroys him. He thinks that by understanding everything, by analyzing every situation, by maintaining perfect awareness, he can protect himself from being hurt or humiliated. But this attempt at control only results in deeper isolation and suffering. True freedom, Dostoevsky suggests, comes not from perfect rational control, but from the willingness to let go of control, to trust something beyond oneself, to enter into relationship despite all the risks that entails. This is a paradox that runs through all of Dostoevsky's work. We achieve freedom not by asserting our will against everything else, but by surrendering that will, by accepting our dependence on others, by acknowledging that we are not self-sufficient rational agents, but vulnerable creatures who need love and grace and connection to flourish. The underground man represents the dead end of pure individualism, of the self turned completely in on itself with no window to the outside world. He is what happens when consciousness becomes total and self-sufficient, when a person tries to live entirely in their own head without genuine engagement with others. And Dostoevsky shows us that this way of being is not just unpleasant, but impossible. We are social creatures. We are built for connection. When we cut ourselves off from others, we do not become more free, but less. We do not become more ourselves, but lose ourselves in endless self-reflection that goes nowhere. The self, it turns out, is not something that exists in isolation. It only emerges and develops in relationship with others. The underground man, by rejecting relationship, has in a sense rejected himself, condemned himself to a kind of living death where he exists but does not truly live. This is perhaps why, despite his brilliance and self-awareness, the underground man is such a pitiable figure. He knows so much but understands so little. He can articulate the problems of human existence with precision and insight, but he cannot find his way to the solutions. He can diagnose his own condition perfectly, but diagnosis is not cure. And this gap between understanding and transformation is something that Dostoevsky returns to again and again. Knowledge is not enough. Consciousness is not enough. What is needed is something more like metanoia, a complete transformation of how we approach life, a turning around of the whole self. And this transformation cannot be achieved through conscious effort alone. It requires grace, requires surrender, requires opening oneself to forces beyond one's control. The underground man cannot do this, and so he remains underground, in the darkness, alone with his thoughts, suffering from the very consciousness that was supposed to set him free. Crime and Punishment is often called the greatest psychological novel ever written, and there is truth in that description, but it is also so much more. It is a spiritual journey, a philosophical investigation, a detective story, and a profound meditation on guilt, conscience, and the possibility of moral resurrection. At its center is Rodion Romanovich Raskolnikov, a young man whose very name contains his essential characteristic. Raskolnikov comes from the Russian word raskol, meaning schism or split. He is a divided self, torn between competing visions of who he is and how he should live. And through his crime and the suffering that follows, Dostoevsky traces one of the most compelling portraits of conscience in all of literature. When we meet Raskolnikov, he is living in extreme poverty in St. Petersburg, inhabiting a tiny room that is more like a coffin than a living space. He has been a brilliant student, but has dropped out of university because he can no longer afford the fees. He wanders the streets in a daze, caught up in an idea that has taken possession of him. The idea is this: there are two categories of human beings, the ordinary and the extraordinary. Ordinary people must obey conventional morality, must live within the rules that society establishes. But extraordinary people, people who contribute something significant to human progress, are entitled to step over these boundaries. They can commit crimes if those crimes serve a higher purpose. Napoleon killed thousands in his wars of conquest, but history remembers him as great because he reshaped the world. Some people have the right to transgress, and Raskolnikov believes, or wants to believe, that he is one of these extraordinary individuals. Armed with this theory, he decides to test himself by committing murder. His target is an old pawnbroker named Alyona Ivanovna, a woman he tells himself is worthless, even harmful to others. She lends money at cruel rates, taking advantage of the desperate poor. The world would be better off without her, and her money could be put to better use. He will kill her, take her money, and use it to complete his education and go on to do good in the world. The logic seems impeccable. One life that has no value eliminated, many lives improved as a result. And he will prove to himself that he belongs to the category of extraordinary people, that he has the strength to step beyond conventional morality. It is a test, an experiment, and Raskolnikov approaches it with the cold calculation of someone conducting a scientific inquiry. But from the moment he commits the act, everything goes wrong. Not just practically, though, that too. He had planned carefully, but during the actual murder, he panics. He has to kill not only the pawnbroker, but also her innocent sister, Lizaveta, who walks in unexpectedly. Lizaveta is exactly the kind of poor, gentle, defenseless person Raskolnikov claimed he wanted to help, and now she lies dead by his hand. He barely escapes without being seen, manages to hide some of the stolen goods, but leaves evidence behind. The careful planner dissolves into a frightened animal. Yet the practical difficulties are nothing compared to what begins happening inside him. He thought he could commit murder and remain unchanged, that his rational theory would protect him from guilt. Instead, he begins to fall apart psychologically. He develops a fever, falls into delirium, alternates between terror and a strange, desperate recklessness. He cannot eat or sleep. He alienates his friend Razumikin, frightens his mother and sister when they arrive in the city, behaves so strangely that he attracts the attention of the detective Porfiry Petrovich, who begins to suspect him. What Dostoevsky captures so brilliantly is the texture of guilt, the way it manifests not as a simple feeling but as a total derangement of one's being. Raskolnikov cannot escape himself. Everywhere he goes, he carries the weight of what he has done. He revisits the scene of the crime compulsively, asking questions about the murder, behaving in ways that all but announce his guilt. He is simultaneously desperate to conceal his crime and desperate to confess it. He wants to prove he was right to do it, but he also wants to be caught and punished. These contradictory impulses war within him, tearing him apart. And the more he tries to justify himself, the more his justifications ring hollow. He tells himself that conscience is just superstition, that his suffering is merely a symptom of belonging to the ordinary category of humans after all. But these thoughts provide no relief. Something in him knows that what he has done is not just practically unwise, but fundamentally wrong, a violation of something sacred. The character of Porfiry Petrovich, the detective investigating the case, represents the voice of that knowledge. Porfiry is one of Dostoevsky's most subtle creations, a man who combines genuine psychological insight with a kind of compassionate understanding. He suspects Raskolnikov almost immediately, but his goal is not simply to trap him with evidence. Instead, he plays a long game, engaging Raskolnikov in philosophical conversations, pushing him to see the contradictions in his own theory, waiting for the psychological pressure to become unbearable so that Raskolnikov will confess not because the evidence is overwhelming, but because he cannot stand the guilt any longer. Porfiry understands that Raskolnikov's real punishment is not whatever sentence the law will impose, but the suffering of his own conscience. And in their conversations, Porfiry suggests something crucial, that Raskolnikov's very suffering is a sign of his humanity, proof that he is not the amoral Superman he wanted to be, but an ordinary human being with a conscience that cannot be reasoned away. Into this psychological hell comes Sonya Marmeladov, and she changes everything. Sonya is the daughter of a drunken clerk named Marmeladov, whom Raskolnikov met briefly before the murder. Marmeladov told Raskolnikov his pathetic life story, how his drinking has destroyed his family, how his daughter Sonya had to become a prostitute to feed her stepmother and siblings. Despite his degradation, Marmeladov spoke with a strange faith that God would have mercy on people like him, that Christ came precisely for sinners. He was trampled to death by horses shortly after, and Raskolnikov, in a spontaneous act of compassion that contradicts his theory about extraordinary people being above ordinary morality, helped get Marmeladov home and gave money to the family. This is how he meets Sonia. She is young, marked by the degrading work she has to do, but she carries herself with an integrity that is almost luminous. She has sacrificed herself for her family, accepting shame and suffering so that her young siblings will not starve. She represents a kind of selfless love that is the opposite of everything Raskolnikov's theory stands for. Raskolnikov is drawn to Sonia in a way he cannot fully explain. He seeks her out and eventually confesses his crime to her, partly to test her reaction, partly because he desperately needs to tell someone. Her response is not what he expects. She does not recoil in horror. She does not judge him. Instead, she weeps for him, seeing immediately that he has destroyed not just 2 other lives, but his own. She asks him the question that cuts through all his rationalizations. How will you live now? What will you do with the knowledge of what you have done? And when he tries to defend himself, tries to explain his theory, she cuts through that too with devastating simplicity. She tells him that he must confess, must accept his suffering, must turn himself into the authorities. Only through accepting punishment can he begin to find peace, and she promises that she will follow him, will stand by him, will go with him even to Siberia if that is where he is sent. In one of the most powerful scenes in the novel, Sonia reads to Raskolnikov the story of Lazarus from the Gospel of John. Raskolnikov has asked for her Bible, curious about what sustains her faith despite everything she has suffered. She begins to read, and as she reads the story of Lazarus, the man who was dead for 4 days and was raised to life by Jesus, her voice grows stronger and more passionate. She is reading not just for Raskolnikov but for herself, proclaiming her faith that resurrection is possible, that what is dead can live again. The symbolism is transparent. Raskolnikov is dead, spiritually dead, even though his body lives. He has cut himself off from humanity through his crime and his attempt to place himself above moral law. And Sonia is offering him the possibility of resurrection, of returning to life, but only through the path of suffering and confession and transformation. What makes Sonia such a powerful figure is that she embodies a kind of faith that is not based on naivete or ignorance. She knows suffering intimately. She knows degradation and shame. She has every reason to be bitter and resentful. Yet she maintains a capacity for love and compassion that seems to come from somewhere beyond herself. She is not preachy or self-righteous. She does not claim to be better than anyone. In fact, she sees herself as a sinner, someone who has transgressed religious law through prostitution. And yet she trusts in mercy, trusts that God loves even those who are most degraded, that no one is beyond redemption. Her faith is not a comfortable belief, but a desperate hope, something she clings to because without it there would be nothing. And this quality of faith, faith maintained through darkness rather than in spite of darkness, is what Dostoevsky values most. Raskolnikov resists Sonia's urging for a long time. He is still too proud, still too attached to his theory, still trying to prove that he was right to do what he did. But slowly, the weight of his guilt becomes unbearable. He realizes that he cannot continue as he is, that the suffering of concealment is worse than any punishment the law could impose. And finally, at Sonia's urging, he goes to the police station and confesses. Even then, he cannot fully abandon his pride. He confesses partly to end his suffering, not entirely out of genuine repentance. But the confession itself is the crucial first step. By speaking the truth aloud, by taking responsibility for his actions, he begins the process of returning to the human community he had tried to separate himself from. He is sentenced to 8 years of hard labor in Siberia, and true to her word, Sonia follows him there. The epilogue of Crime and Punishment takes place in Siberia, and here Dostoevsky shows us the slow, difficult process of transformation. Even in prison, Raskolnikov remains proud and isolated for a long time. He does not feel genuine remorse. He suffers, but his suffering is more about wounded pride than true repentance. The other prisoners sense something off about him and treat him coldly, while they love Sonia, who has moved to the nearby town and visits the prison regularly. She brings them small comforts, treats everyone with kindness, and gradually wins the affection even of hardened criminals. Raskolnikov watches this and feels jealous and confused. He still cannot understand what she has that he lacks. Then one day, he falls seriously ill. When he recovers, something has shifted in him. He begins to see Sonia differently, begins to feel rather than just think. One evening, he goes to her, and they sit together in silence. And suddenly he is on his knees before her, weeping, holding her hands. In that moment, the last of his pride breaks. He realizes that he loves her, that she has been loving him all along without condition or demand, that this love is the only real thing in his life. The novel ends with the suggestion that now, finally, his true resurrection can begin. It has taken years of suffering, but the stone has been rolled away from the tomb of his heart, and he is beginning to live again. Dostoevsky does not describe this transformation in detail. He simply tells us that a new story is beginning, the story of Raskolnikov's gradual renewal, but that this story belongs to the future, and we will not follow it further. What makes Crime and Punishment so profound is the way it shows that intellectual understanding is not transformation. Raskolnikov is intelligent enough to see the flaws in his own theory fairly quickly, but seeing intellectually that you were wrong is not the same as changing. Change requires something deeper, something more like a death of the old self and a birth of the new. It requires suffering that cracks open the hardened heart. It requires love that persists even when it is not returned. It requires time and patience and grace. Porfiry tells Raskolnikov at one point that he will eventually come to need suffering, will seek it out as the only path to peace. This seems paradoxical, but it proves true. Raskolnikov discovers that trying to avoid the consequences of his actions only creates more suffering. Accepting the consequences, accepting punishment, accepting his place among ordinary suffering humanity rather than above it, this is what finally allows him to begin healing. The novel is also a powerful critique of utilitarian ethics and of any system that tries to calculate whether one person's life has more value than another's. Raskolnikov's theory is essentially a utilitarian calculus. The pawnbroker's life is worth less than the potential good he could do with her money, so killing her is justified. But Dostoevsky shows that this way of thinking is monstrous because it denies the absolute value of each human life. The moment you start trying to measure who deserves to live and who does not, you have already crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed. Every person, no matter how degraded or difficult, contains something sacred, and that sacred quality is not subject to our calculations and judgments. When Raskolnikov kills the pawnbroker, he violates this principle, and his conscience rebels not because of social conditioning, but because he has touched something fundamental and absolute. Sonia represents the alternative to Raskolnikov's approach. Where he tries to calculate and justify, she simply loves. Where he tries to place himself above others, she sees herself as no better than anyone else. Where he relies on his own will and reason, she trusts in a grace that comes from beyond herself. And the novel suggests that her way, however humble and irrational it may seem, is actually wiser than his way. Love cannot be justified by utilitarian calculus. Mercy cannot be proven through logical argument. Faith cannot be demonstrated like a mathematical theorem. These things belong to a different order of reality. And Dostoevsky is suggesting that this order is more fundamental, more real, more trustworthy than the order of rational calculation. As we reflect on Raskolnikov's journey, we might see in it a pattern that applies more broadly to our own moral lives. We all commit transgressions, perhaps not as dramatic as murder, but violations nonetheless of our own sense of what is right. And when we do, we face a choice. We can try to justify ourselves, explain away our actions, rationalize our behavior until we convince ourselves that we did nothing wrong. Or we can face what we have done honestly, accept responsibility, and begin the difficult work of making amends and changing. The first path seems easier at first but leads to increasing isolation and internal suffering. The second path requires humility and courage, but offers the possibility of genuine transformation and peace. Raskolnikov takes the long way to this realization, suffering terribly before he can finally let go of his pride and accept his need for forgiveness. But he does eventually get there, and the novel ends on a note of hope, suggesting that no one is beyond redemption if they can find the courage to face themselves honestly and open themselves to love. The Brothers Karamazov is Dostoevsky's final novel, written near the end of his life when he was struggling with illness and knew that his time was limited. It is his longest and most ambitious work, a vast exploration of faith and doubt, guilt and innocence, reason and love, woven together through the story of a single family in crisis. At the center are 3 legitimate brothers and 1 illegitimate brother, each representing a different aspect of human nature. And through their interactions and conflicts, Dostoevsky attempts to address the deepest questions that had haunted him throughout his life. Can faith survive in a world full of suffering? Is there any meaning to existence, or is everything permitted? What is the proper way to live when faced with the apparent absence of God? These are not abstract philosophical questions for Dostoevsky, but matters of life and death. Questions that determine whether existence is bearable or unbearable, whether we can find reasons to go on, or must descend into despair or nihilism. The father of this family is Fyodor Pavlovich Karamazov, a repulsive figure who embodies pure appetite without conscience or dignity. He is a buffoon, a sensualist, a liar, someone who has devoted his entire life to the pursuit of pleasure and money without any regard for others. He abandoned his first wife and neglected his children. He is now in his 50s, competing with his own son for the affections of a young woman, displaying his baseness openly without shame. And yet even Fyodor is not entirely flat as a character. Dostoevsky gives him moments of surprising insight, brief flashes when he seems aware of his own degradation and almost mourns it. But these moments pass quickly, and he returns to his appetites. He represents what a human being becomes when all higher aspirations are abandoned, when consciousness is enslaved to desire, when there is no ideal to reach toward. He is the lowest form of human existence, barely distinguishable from pure animal life, except that his degradation is chosen, which makes it somehow more disturbing than mere ignorance would be. The three legitimate brothers could hardly be more different from one another. Dmitri, the eldest, is passionate and impulsive, a sensualist like his father, but with a spark of something higher, a capacity for shame and self-disgust that his father lacks. Dmitri represents the life force itself, chaotic and excessive, capable of both great tenderness and terrible violence. He is embroiled in a passionate affair with Grushenka, the same woman his father desires, and this rivalry brings the family conflict to a crisis point. Dmitri is always in motion, always at extremes, never moderate or calm. He can weep over beauty one moment and threaten murder the next. He embodies what Dostoevsky saw as essentially Russian in character, a wild generosity combined with wild destructiveness, a soul that cannot find balance or middle ground. Ivan, the middle brother, represents pure intellect. He is a scholar, a writer, someone who has devoted himself to understanding the world through reason. He is brilliant, articulate, and tormented by his inability to reconcile his rational mind with the existence of suffering, particularly the suffering of children. Ivan has constructed an intellectual argument against God, or rather against accepting God's creation, that is one of the most powerful pieces of atheistic reasoning ever written. And yet, Ivan is not at peace with his atheism. His rejection of God has left him feeling that everything is permitted, that there is no basis for morality, and this realization fills him with anguish rather than liberation. He represents the crisis of modern consciousness, the person who can no longer believe, but who cannot comfortably accept unbelief either. He is trapped between faith and nihilism, unable to rest in either position. Alyosha, the youngest brother, is the spiritual center of the novel. He is gentle, compassionate, and devoted to the teachings of his spiritual guide, the elder Zosima. Unlike his brothers, Alyosha seems to have found a path that brings peace. He is training to become a monk, living at the monastery, trying to embody the ideal of active love that Zosima preaches. He is not naive or simple-minded. He understands his brother's struggles. He sees the evil and suffering in the world. But he has chosen faith, chosen to believe that love is the answer even when reason cannot prove it. Alyosha represents what Dostoevsky believed a human being could become, a person in whom faith and reason, spirituality and worldly engagement are somehow integrated. He is sent back into the world by Zosima, told that his path lies not in monastic isolation, but in serving others, in being present to suffering without becoming hardened or despairing. The fourth brother, Smerdyakov, is illegitimate, the son of Fyodor and a mute woman who died giving birth. He was raised as a servant in the Karamazov household, treated with contempt, growing up twisted and resentful. He is intelligent, but his intelligence has curdled into cunning. He attaches himself to Ivan, sees Ivan as his teacher, absorbs Ivan's ideas about the non-existence of God and the permissibility of all actions. Smerdyakov represents the logical conclusion of nihilism when embraced by someone without moral foundation. If there is no God and everything is permitted, then why not commit any crime that serves one's interest? Smerdyakov is the dark answer to Ivan's philosophical speculations, showing what happens when nihilistic ideas are taken seriously by someone without the internal restraints of conscience or compassion. The plot centers on the murder of Fyodor Pavlovich. Everyone in the family has reason to want him dead. Dmitri has threatened to kill him repeatedly, driven mad by their rivalry over Grushenka and by Fyodor's refusal to give Dmitri money he believes is rightfully his. On the night of the murder, Dmitri breaks into his father's garden, desperate for money. Suspecting that Grushenka is with his father, he peers through the window, sees his father alone, picks up a brass pestle and considers striking him, but then he decides against it and runs away. Later that night, Fyodor is found murdered, apparently killed with that same pestle. All the evidence points to Dmitri, and he is arrested, put on trial, and eventually convicted of a crime he did not commit. The real murderer is Smerdyakov, who kills Fyodor partly for money, partly out of resentment, and partly, he claims, because Ivan's ideas gave him permission. Ivan had been saying that if there is no God and no immortality, then everything is permitted. Smerdyakov took this literally and acted on it. When Ivan discovers the truth, he is shattered. He realizes that his ideas, which he thought were purely theoretical, have had terrible real-world consequences. He is not directly guilty of murder, but he is morally implicated. His nihilism created the conditions in which Smerdyakov could act without conscience. This drives Ivan into a psychological breakdown. He begins hallucinating, arguing with a devil who may be real or may be a projection of his own tortured psyche. He goes to confess at Dmitri's trial, but is not believed because he appears to be losing his mind. Smerdyakov hangs himself, unable to live with what he has done, and Ivan is left in a state of torment, his intellectual certainties destroyed, his sanity in question. What Dostoevsky is showing through this complex plot is how ideas have consequences, how what we believe shapes what we do, and how a society or individual without faith in something transcendent inevitably collapses into either despair or amorality. Ivan's mistake was thinking he could reject God while maintaining moral values, but Dostoevsky argues that moral values require some absolute foundation. If there is no God, no immortality, no ultimate justice, then why should we behave morally? Why not pursue pleasure and power like Fyodor? Why not commit murder like Smerdyakov if we can get away with it? The question, why be good, requires an answer. And if the answer is only because society says so, or because it serves my long-term self-interest, then those answers are too weak to sustain morality when they conflict with immediate desire or perceived advantage. But the novel is not simply a defense of traditional religious belief. Dostoevsky was too honest for that. Through Ivan, he gives voice to the strongest arguments against faith. The most famous of these is Ivan's rebellion, his refusal to accept a universe in which innocent children suffer. In a long conversation with Alyosha at a tavern, Ivan tells stories of children being tortured, abused, killed. He is not making up these stories. They are based on actual cases reported in newspapers. A general sets his dogs on a peasant boy who accidentally injured one of his hounds. The boy is torn to pieces in front of his mother. A 5-year-old girl is locked in an outhouse all night in the freezing cold by her parents, and she cries out to God to save her, but no salvation comes. Ivan asks Alyosha how these sufferings can be justified. Even if at the end of time there is some grand harmony, some resolution where everything makes sense and all the suffering is somehow redeemed, Ivan says he rejects that harmony. He will not accept a world order built on the suffering of innocent children. He hands back his ticket to paradise, as he puts it. He cannot believe in a God who would create such a world. And even if such a God exists, Ivan will not worship him. This is not a straw man argument that Dostoevsky sets up only to knock down. Ivan's rebellion is given full force and eloquence. Dostoevsky takes it seriously because he felt the force of it himself. The suffering of the innocent is the hardest problem for faith, the rock on which belief crashes and sometimes shatters. How can a good and omnipotent God permit such suffering? The traditional theological answers about free will and the need for a world where genuine moral choice is possible do not seem adequate when we are confronted with the actual sight of a child in agony. Ivan's position is morally powerful. He is rebelling not from selfishness, but from a deep sense of justice. He cannot accept a cosmic order that requires innocent suffering as its price. Dostoevsky's response to Ivan comes not in the form of a philosophical argument, but through a story that Ivan himself tells. Ivan has written a poem called The Grand Inquisitor, and he recites it to Alyosha. In the poem, Christ returns to earth during the Spanish Inquisition, appearing in Seville, where heretics are being burned at the stake. He performs miracles, heals the sick, raises a dead child. The people recognize him and rejoice, but the Grand Inquisitor, the old cardinal who runs the Inquisition, has Christ arrested. That night, the Inquisitor visits Christ in his cell and delivers a long monologue explaining why Christ must be executed again. The Inquisitor says that Christ's teaching was a mistake. By giving people freedom, by refusing to perform miracles that would compel belief, by insisting that faith must be freely chosen, Christ placed an unbearable burden on humanity. Most people do not want freedom. They want security, bread, someone to tell them what to believe. The Inquisitor and the Church have corrected Christ's mistake. They have taken away human freedom and given people what they really need: comfort, certainty, and authority. They have built their system on miracle, mystery, and authority, the very things Christ rejected when he was tempted in the wilderness, and the Inquisitor claims this is an act of love. The Church bears the burden of freedom so that ordinary people do not have to. They have enslaved humanity for humanity's own good. Throughout this speech, Christ says nothing. He simply listens. And at the end, when the Inquisitor finishes and says that Christ must be burned the next day, Christ approaches him and kisses him softly on his old bloodless lips. The kiss burns in the Inquisitor's heart, but he opens the cell door and tells Christ to go and never return. This story operates on many levels. On one level, it is a critique of institutional religion, of how the Church has often betrayed Christ's teaching by seeking power and control, rather than serving love and freedom. But on another level, it is addressing Ivan's rebellion. The Grand Inquisitor represents a kind of compassion that leads to totalitarianism. He wants to protect people from the burden of freedom by taking away their choice. He thinks this is merciful, but Dostoevsky, through Christ's silence and kiss, suggests something different. The gift of freedom is more valuable than comfort or security. Human beings are made for freedom, for genuine choice, and any system that takes that away, even with good intentions, diminishes our humanity. The suffering that comes with freedom is real and terrible, but the alternative, a world of controlled contentment where we are treated like children or like animals, is worse because it denies what is essential in us. Christ's kiss is Dostoevsky's answer to Ivan. It is not a logical argument. It is an act of love. The Inquisitor has just explained why Christ was wrong, why the Church was right to reject his teaching, why Christ must be killed again. And Christ's response is simply to love him. This is what Dostoevsky believed, that in the end, love is the only real answer to the problem of suffering. Not an answer that explains it away or justifies it, but an answer that responds to it with presence and compassion. When we are confronted with suffering, particularly innocent suffering, reason fails. We cannot make sense of it, but we can choose how to respond. We can respond with bitterness and rejection, like Ivan. Or we can respond with love, like Christ, like Alyosha, like Zosima. And Dostoevsky believed, or wanted to believe, that this choice of love, even in the face of all the suffering in the world, is what redeems existence, what makes life bearable and even beautiful. The character of Father Zosima embodies this faith. He is an elder at the monastery, a holy man whom people come to see for advice and blessing. He is old and dying when we meet him, and his teachings are presented in a long section of the novel that can feel disconnected from the plot. But these teachings are crucial because they represent Dostoevsky's positive vision, his answer to all the doubts and questions raised by Ivan and others. Zosima teaches active love. He says that we must love people concretely, in their actuality, not in abstract theory. Abstract love for humanity is easy. We can love the people in general while treating actual individual people with contempt. But real love, love for this specific person in front of us, with all their flaws and difficulties, that is hard, and yet that is what Christ calls us to. Zosima also teaches that each of us is responsible for all. We are all connected, all guilty, all in need of mercy. When we judge others, we are judging ourselves. When we refuse forgiveness to others, we are refusing it to ourselves. The path to holiness is not through withdrawing from the world, but through entering more fully into it, bearing its sufferings alongside others, offering whatever comfort and help we can. Zosima's death creates a crisis of faith for Alyosha. There was an expectation that when a holy elder died, his body would not decay, that this would be a sign of his sanctity. But when Zosima dies, his body begins to stink almost immediately, decomposing faster than normal. This is taken by some at the monastery as a sign that Zosima was not actually holy, that God is somehow rejecting him. Alyosha is shaken. He had believed in Zosima completely, and this apparent sign against him throws everything into doubt. It is a small-scale version of the problem of suffering that Ivan raised. If God is good, why does he allow even this small humiliation of a good man? Alyosha, in his crisis, is tempted to despair, tempted to agree with Ivan that the world is unjust and faith is naive. But then something happens that restores Alyosha's faith. He falls asleep and has a dream or vision in which he sees Zosima at the wedding at Cana, the miracle where Christ turned water into wine. Zosima is there, joyful, telling Alyosha that he too has been invited to the feast. When Alyosha wakes, he is transformed. He goes outside and falls to the earth, kissing it, weeping, vowing to love the earth and all of life. Something has been resolved in him. He has moved through his crisis of faith and emerged with a deeper, more mature faith on the other side. This scene is one of the most beautiful in all of Dostoevsky's work. A moment of pure affirmation after so much darkness and doubt. The novel ends with a funeral, but not Zosima's. A young boy named Ilyusha has died, and Alyosha gathers the boys who were Ilyusha's friends. He speaks to them about memory and love, about how even though Ilyusha is dead, he will live on in their memories, in the love they shared. And he tells them that they must remember this moment, this feeling of connection and shared grief, and carry it with them throughout their lives. They promise to remember, and they shout together, "Hurrah for Karamazov!" It is a strange ending for such a dark and complex novel, this scene of boys shouting together at a funeral. But it represents hope. The next generation will carry forward the love that Zosima taught. Alyosha will live in the world, not in a monastery, and will spread that love to others. The war of the soul that played out in the Karamazov family, between faith and doubt, between love and despair, between freedom and control, will continue. But it is a war worth fighting, because in choosing love despite everything, we affirm that life has meaning, that existence is not absurd, that there is something worth preserving and nurturing even in a world full of suffering. The Brothers Karamazov contains multitudes. It is too large and complex to be summarized or reduced to a single message. But at its heart is Dostoevsky's conviction that we cannot live by reason alone, that faith, however difficult and mysterious, is necessary for a fully human life. Not faith as dogma or certainty, but faith as a commitment, a wager, a choice to believe in love and meaning even when they cannot be proven. Ivan represents the crisis of modernity, the inability to believe combined with the inability to live without believing. Alyosha represents the possibility of a faith that has looked honestly at all the doubts, acknowledged all the suffering, and still chosen to affirm life. And the novel as a whole represents Dostoevsky, his final attempt to show that this choice is not naive or weak, but requires tremendous courage and is the only path to peace. The problem of innocent suffering stands at the center of religious and philosophical thought like an immovable stone. Every system of meaning must somehow account for it or admit defeat. Why do children suffer? Why is there so much pain in the world that seems undeserved, random, senseless? These questions have no satisfying answers, and Dostoevsky knew this. He did not try to explain away suffering or to justify it through theological argument. Instead, he faced it directly, allowed it to have its full weight, and then asked what remains when we have acknowledged the worst. Can faith survive the encounter with innocent suffering? Can meaning persist when confronted with the apparent meaninglessness of a child in agony? These are the questions that Ivan Karamazov raises with such force, and they are questions that Dostoevsky himself struggled with throughout his life. Ivan's rebellion against God is based entirely on the suffering of children. He tells Alyosha that he could perhaps accept his own suffering. An adult has sinned, has made choices, can be held responsible in some way for the consequences of those choices. But a child is innocent. A child has done nothing to deserve suffering. And yet children suffer terribly. And God, if he exists, allows this suffering to continue. Ivan collects stories of child abuse and torture with the obsessive quality of someone gathering evidence for a prosecution. He tells these stories to Alyosha in excruciating detail, not to shock, but to make the problem impossible to evade. A peasant boy throws a stone and accidentally lames a general's favorite dog. The general has the boy stripped naked and hunted down by hounds in front of the boy's mother. The child is torn to pieces. What possible justification can there be for allowing such a thing to happen? Ivan anticipates the usual responses. Perhaps it is necessary for some ultimate harmony. Perhaps at the end of time, all will be revealed and reconciled. And even this suffering will somehow make sense as part of a larger plan. Perhaps the mother will embrace the general in heaven, and they will understand together how all things work for good. But Ivan rejects this absolutely. He says that no ultimate harmony can justify the suffering of even one child. If the price of eternal joy is built on the torture of a single innocent creature, then he will not pay that price. He hands back his ticket to paradise, as he puts it. He will not accept a world order constructed on such a foundation, even if it eventually leads to perfect happiness. The moral cost is too high. Some things should not happen, period. And if God's plan requires them to happen, then Ivan rejects both the plan and God. This argument has tremendous power because it appeals to our deepest moral intuitions. When we see a child suffering, something in us rises up in protest. It feels fundamentally wrong in a way that transcends cultural conditioning or rational calculation. Ivan is giving voice to this protest, articulating what we all feel when confronted with innocent suffering. And Dostoevsky does not undermine or dismiss Ivan's position. He lets it stand in all its force. Ivan is not portrayed as simply wrong or misguided. His rebellion comes from a genuine moral sensitivity, from an inability to accept injustice, from a refusal to comfort himself with distant promises of ultimate reconciliation when a child is suffering right now. In this sense, Ivan is more moral than those believers who can accept suffering with equanimity because they trust that God knows best. Ivan's protest is the protest of conscience against what appears to be cosmic injustice. But Dostoevsky also shows where Ivan's rebellion leads. Ivan thinks his position is purely rational and moral, but it has consequences that he has not fully thought through. If there is no God, if the universe is not governed by moral purpose, if there is no ultimate justice, then what becomes of morality itself? On what basis do we judge anything as right or wrong? Ivan says that if God does not exist, then everything is permitted. There is no objective moral law, only human convention and preference. This is the logical conclusion of his atheism. But Ivan is not comfortable with it. He has rejected God in the name of morality, but rejecting God undermines the foundation of morality. He is caught in a contradiction that eventually tears him apart psychologically. He cannot believe in God, but he also cannot live with the implications of not believing. This contradiction is embodied in Smerdyakov, who takes Ivan's ideas seriously and acts on them. Smerdyakov murders Fyodor Pavlovich and then tells Ivan that Ivan is the real murderer, because it was Ivan's ideas that gave him permission. If there is no God and everything is permitted, then why not kill? Why not steal? Why not do whatever serves one's interest? Smerdyakov is not distorting Ivan's ideas. He is simply following them to their logical conclusion without the bourgeois sentimentality that prevents Ivan from doing so himself. Ivan is horrified by this. He insists that he did not want his father dead, that he is not responsible for Smerdyakov's crime. But Smerdyakov's accusation haunts him. He begins to see himself as complicit, as having created the conditions in which murder became thinkable. His ideas, which he thought were purely theoretical, have proven to have terrible practical consequences. The scene where Ivan hallucinates a visit from the devil is one of the most brilliant in all of literature. The devil appears as a shabby gentleman, a parasite, someone who reflects back to Ivan his own worst qualities. The devil engages Ivan in conversation, mocking him, revealing the contradictions in his thinking, suggesting that Ivan wants to believe in God but cannot, wants to be moral but has no foundation for morality. The devil tells Ivan that he suffers precisely because he cannot resolve these contradictions, because he is too honest to comfort himself with lies, but too moral to accept the nihilistic implications of his atheism. Whether this devil is real or a projection of Ivan's own psyche hardly matters. What matters is that Ivan is confronting the consequences of his position, and it is driving him mad. He ends up in a state of complete psychological breakdown, appearing at his brother's trial to confess that he is the real murderer, speaking in a confused and fevered way that makes people doubt his sanity. His rebellion against God has led not to liberation but to destruction. So what is Dostoevsky saying through all of this? Is he simply arguing that we must believe in God or go mad? That is too simple. Dostoevsky is not presenting a logical proof for God's existence. He is showing something more subtle and more difficult. He is showing that the problem of innocent suffering is genuinely insoluble at the level of rational argument. Ivan is right that we cannot justify a world that contains the suffering of children. There is no theodicy, no defense of God's justice that makes the problem go away. The best theological minds have tried for millennia to solve this problem, and none have succeeded in a way that satisfies both reason and conscience. The problem remains, a scandal to faith, a stone that that cannot be moved. But Dostoevsky is also showing that rejecting God because of this problem does not solve anything. It only creates new problems, perhaps worse ones. If we say that the suffering of children proves there is no God, then we are left in a universe without ultimate meaning or justice, where suffering is simply a brute fact that means nothing, where the child's agony is not even a tragedy, but merely an event, no more significant than a stone falling or water flowing downhill. At least in a universe with God, the suffering of the innocent is a problem, something that demands to be accounted for, something that feels wrong. But in a universe without God, it is not even a problem. It just is. And that seems even less bearable than the mystery of a God who allows suffering. Dostoevsky's answer, to the extent that he offers one, is not intellectual but existential. It comes through characters like Zosima and Alyosha, who choose to respond to suffering with active love, rather than with either theological justification or atheistic rebellion. When Zosima teaches about love, he is not explaining why suffering exists. He is offering a way to respond to it that preserves meaning and purpose. We cannot understand why children suffer. We cannot make sense of it, but we can choose how we respond. We can respond with bitterness, anger, rejection of the world and God, like Ivan. Or we can respond by becoming agents of love and compassion ourselves, by reducing suffering where we can, by standing with those who suffer, by refusing to let suffering have the last word. This is not a solution to the problem. It is a way of living with the problem, of transforming how we relate to it. In one sense, Zosima's teaching agrees with Ivan's rebellion. Both refuse to justify suffering. Zosima does not say that suffering is good or necessary, or part of some plan that makes it acceptable. He simply says that the response to suffering is love. When we see someone suffering, we should not try to explain it or justify it. We should help them. We should be present to them. We should bear their burden with them. This is what Christ did. He did not explain suffering. He entered into it. He suffered alongside humanity. And in that solidarity, in that willingness to descend into hell with us, something redemptive happens, even if we cannot fully articulate what it is. The figure of Sonia in Crime and Punishment embodies this same approach. She has suffered terribly herself. She has been degraded, forced into prostitution, lived with shame and hardship. She has every reason to be bitter, to reject God, to ask why she has to suffer when she has done nothing wrong. But instead she maintains faith, not a comfortable faith, not a faith that explains away her suffering, but a desperate faith that clings to the possibility of mercy and redemption. And her faith is not passive. It expresses itself in active love. She sacrifices herself for her family. She follows Raskolnikov to Siberia, standing by him even though she owes him nothing. She embodies the teaching that Zosima articulates, that love is the response to suffering, that we cannot explain the darkness, but we can light a candle. There is a moment in The Brothers Karamazov when a woman comes to Zosima in despair. She has lost a child, and her grief is unbearable. She asks him how she can go on living. He does not tell her that her child is in a better place, or that God needed another angel, or any of the easy consolations that people offer. He simply acknowledges her grief. He tells her that her love for her child is holy, that the depth of her pain is the measure of the depth of her love, and that this love connects her to something eternal. He does not take away her grief. He validates it, honors it, and then gently suggests that she can begin to heal by loving others, by turning her maternal love outward toward other children who need care. It is not that she will forget her child or stop grieving, but that she can allow the love she has for her child to flow into the world as compassion for others who suffer. This is the pattern that Dostoevsky returns to again and again. Suffering is real and terrible and cannot be explained away, but it can be transformed through love. The person who suffers can choose to let that suffering make them bitter and closed, or they can choose to let it make them compassionate and open. The suffering itself is not good, but the compassion it can produce if we allow it is good. The person who has suffered deeply knows what it is to need help, knows what it is to be broken, and this knowledge can make them capable of a deeper kindness toward others. They become wounded healers, carrying their own scars but using them to help others heal. Ivan cannot accept this because he wants absolute justice. He wants the world to make sense in clear moral terms. He wants punishment for the wicked and reward for the good. He wants suffering to be explained and justified. But the world does not work this way. The world is messier, more mysterious, more morally ambiguous than Ivan's categories can accommodate. And rather than accept this ambiguity and find a way to live within it, Ivan breaks under the strain of trying to force reality into his moral framework. Alyosha, by contrast, accepts the mystery. He does not understand why children suffer. He cannot explain it, but he trusts that love is still possible, still meaningful, still the right response, even in a world that contains such suffering. His faith is not based on having answers, but on a commitment to love despite not having answers. The problem of innocent suffering does not have a solution, not in any intellectual sense. It remains a wound in the heart of existence, something that troubles believers and unbelievers alike. But Dostoevsky is suggesting that perhaps the point is not to solve the problem, but to live rightly in the presence of it, to acknowledge the suffering honestly without trying to minimize it, to protest against it as Ivan does, to refuse to accept it passively, but then also to respond with love, with compassion, with solidarity with those who suffer. Not because this makes the suffering understandable or acceptable, but because love is the only force strong enough to resist the darkness, the only answer that does not add to the world's pain, but works to heal it. As we rest in these difficult thoughts, as we allow ourselves to feel the weight of the problem that Dostoevsky is grappling with, we might recognize that he is not offering comfort in any cheap sense. He is not telling us that everything happens for a reason, or that suffering is secretly good. He is simply walking with us through the hardest questions, refusing to look away from the worst realities, and then suggesting that even here, even in the face of innocent suffering, the choice of love remains possible and necessary. This is a demanding vision. It asks us to hold two truths simultaneously, that suffering is real and terrible and unjustifiable, and that love is still possible and still the right response. These truths seem to contradict each other, but Dostoevsky insists that we must hold both, must live in the tension between them, because that tension is the actual texture of human existence in a world that is both beautiful and broken. Faith, for Dostoevsky, is not a comfortable certainty or a set of propositions to be believed. It is not something that reason can establish or that evidence can prove. It is rather a kind of wager, a leap through darkness, a choice made when all the rational arguments have exhausted themselves and we must nevertheless decide how to live. Dostoevsky came to this understanding of faith through his own struggles, his encounter with death at the firing squad, his years in prison among murderers and thieves, his lifelong battle with epilepsy and doubt. He wanted to believe, desperately wanted to believe, but he was too honest to pretend that belief was easy or rationally compelled. He saw all the difficulties, felt all the doubts, understood all the arguments against faith, and yet he chose faith anyway, not because it made sense, but because he could not live without it. In a letter to a woman who had written to him about her own struggles with doubt, Dostoevsky made a remarkable confession. He said that he was not a child in his faith, and that his Hosanna had passed through a great furnace of doubt. This is a crucial statement for understanding his philosophy. His faith was not naive or unreflective. It was a faith that had confronted all the counter-arguments, wrestled with all the problems, descended into all the darkness, and emerged scarred but intact. He described himself as a child of the age, of disbelief and doubt, and said that this caused him terrible suffering. But he also said that his faith was stronger because it had been tested. It was not a faith that avoided questions, but a faith that had passed through questions and survived them. The Christ figure in Dostoevsky's imagination is not primarily a theological concept, but a living presence, a person who embodies perfect love and who calls us to imitate that love, regardless of the consequences. In The Idiot, Dostoevsky attempted to create a character who would embody Christ-like qualities in the modern world. Prince Mishkin is gentle, compassionate, completely without malice or calculation. He sees the good in everyone, forgives everyone, tries to help everyone, and the world destroys him for it. The other characters, more worldly and cynical, cannot understand him. They take advantage of his goodness, mock his innocence, suspect him of hidden motives because they cannot imagine someone being genuinely selfless. Mishkin falls in love with Nastasia Filipovna, a woman who has been traumatized and degraded, and he offers her unconditional acceptance and respect. But even this love cannot save her because she cannot accept it. She has internalized too much shame, carries too much damage. In the end, Mishkin returns to the mental institution where he began, destroyed by his encounters with a world that has no place for someone like him. The Idiot is often read as a failure, and in some ways it is. Mishkin is too passive, too much a saint and not enough a fully human character. But the novel succeeds in showing how difficult, perhaps impossible, it is to live according to Christ's teachings in the actual world. Mishkin tries to love everyone equally, to refuse judgment, to offer complete forgiveness, and it leads to disaster. He cannot protect the people he loves. He cannot prevent tragedy. His goodness seems useless, even harmful, because it does not account for the reality of evil and human brokenness. And yet Dostoevsky does not conclude from this that Christ's teachings are wrong. Rather, he is showing how radical they are, how far they diverge from what we think of as practical wisdom. To truly live as Christ taught would require becoming a kind of fool in the eyes of the world, accepting suffering that could be avoided, refusing power that could protect us, trusting when trust seems suicidal. This is not a teaching for reasonable people. It is a teaching that transcends reason, that requires faith in something beyond what we can see or prove. In The Brothers Karamazov, Dostoevsky returns to the image of Christ, but this time, Christ is silent. In Ivan's poem about the Grand Inquisitor, Christ listens to the long indictment of his teaching without defending himself, without arguing back, without performing miracles to prove his authority. He simply listens with complete attention and love. And when the Inquisitor finishes, when he has laid out his case for why Christ was wrong to give humanity freedom, why the Church had to correct his mistake, why Christ must be killed again, the only response Christ gives is a kiss. This silence is more powerful than any argument could be. It is the silence of love that does not need to justify itself, that does not engage in debate about whether it should exist or not. It simply is, and it offers itself freely, even to those who reject it. This silent kiss represents Dostoevsky's deepest understanding of faith. Faith is not about winning arguments or proving that you are right. It is about embodying a certain quality of presence, a certain way of being in the world that is characterized by unconditional love. Christ does not argue with the Inquisitor because love cannot be established through argument. You either see it and respond to it, or you do not. The Inquisitor sees it, feels its power in the kiss, but ultimately chooses to reject it, because accepting it would require giving up his entire system of control. He has built his life on the belief that people need to be managed, protected from freedom, given certainty in place of mystery. And Christ's kiss challenges all of that. It says that love is enough, that freedom is worth the cost, that people are capable of more than the Inquisitor believes. But the Inquisitor cannot accept this, and so he sends Christ away. What makes this scene so powerful is that Dostoevsky shows genuine compassion for the Inquisitor. The old cardinal is not simply a villain. He believes he is doing what is best for humanity. He has seen how people suffer under the burden of freedom, how they long for certainty and authority, how they cannot bear the responsibility of choosing their own path, and out of a twisted compassion, he has built a system that takes away their freedom for their own good. He thinks he is more merciful than Christ, more realistic about human nature, and there is truth in his observation that many people do want to escape freedom, do want someone to tell them what to believe and how to live. But Dostoevsky, through Christ's kiss, is saying that this apparent mercy is actually a betrayal, because it treats people as less than they are, robs them of their dignity as free beings, and ultimately creates slaves rather than lovers. Faith, then, is fundamentally about affirming human freedom and dignity, even when doing so is costly and dangerous. It is about trusting that people can choose good even when they often choose evil. It is about believing in the possibility of love, even when love is constantly rejected or betrayed. This is why faith requires courage. It would be easier, safer, more rational to accept the Inquisitor's vision, to build systems of control that protect people from their own worst impulses. But Dostoevsky believes that this path, however practical it seems, leads to something less than human. It creates order at the expense of soul. It produces peace at the cost of meaning. True faith risks disorder, risks suffering, risks failure, because it values freedom and love more than security and control. The character who best embodies this kind of faith is Father Zosima in The Brothers Karamazov. Zosima's teachings, presented in a long section of the novel, represent Dostoevsky's most direct statement of his own spiritual vision. Zosima teaches that everyone is responsible for everyone else. We are all interconnected, all part of one human family. And when we judge or condemn others, we are ultimately judging and condemning ourselves. He teaches that active love is the only real path to faith. Abstract love for humanity is easy because it costs us nothing, but loving actual people, with all their flaws and difficulties, this is the hard work that transforms us. He teaches that we should ask forgiveness of everyone and everything, even the birds and the trees, because all of creation is connected, and our sins ripple out to affect everything. These teachings sound mystical, even irrational, and they are meant to. Zosima is not presenting a logical system, but describing a way of experiencing the world that opens when we let go of our ego-driven separateness and begin to feel our connection with all of existence. He has moments of what might be called cosmic consciousness, where the boundaries between self and world dissolve and everything appears as one interconnected whole, all of it loved by God, all of it sacred. This vision cannot be argued for or proven. It can only be testified to by those who have experienced it, and even then it sounds strange to ears not attuned to hear it. But Dostoevsky believed that this vision represents the truth about reality, that underneath all our separateness and conflict, there is a deeper unity, a love that holds everything together, and that faith is about aligning ourselves with that love. Zosima's faith is not about doctrine or correct belief, but about a quality of soul, a way of being in the world that is characterized by humility, compassion, and joy. He does not spend time arguing theology or defending church teaching. Instead, he focuses on how to live, how to treat others, how to cultivate the inner state that makes love possible. He tells stories from his own life, how he was transformed from a proud young officer into a monk devoted to serving others. He speaks of his brother Markel, who died young but whose words on his deathbed changed Zosima's life. Markel said that everyone is responsible for everyone, that life is paradise if we would only recognize it, that we should ask forgiveness of the birds. These strange, beautiful statements capture something that cannot be captured in ordinary rational discourse. They point toward a reality that reason alone cannot grasp. This is the crucial point about Dostoevsky's understanding of faith. Reason is good and necessary, but it has limits. There are truths that can only be apprehended through other faculties, through intuition or love, or what might be called spiritual perception. Ivan Karamazov represents the person who tries to live by reason alone, and we see how that leads to breakdown and madness. Not because Ivan is stupid or has made logical errors, but because reality is larger than what reason can contain. When we try to force everything through the narrow gate of rational analysis, we end up cutting ourselves off from dimensions of experience that are essential to being fully human. Faith is about reopening those dimensions, about allowing ourselves to experience the world in ways that reason cannot explain, but that feel more true than mere rationality. Alyosha, Zosima's spiritual son, represents the possibility of integrating faith and reason, spirituality and worldly engagement. He is not naive or simple. He understands his brother's struggles. He sees the problems and sufferings of the world clearly, but he has also experienced something through his relationship with Zosima and through his own spiritual practices that gives him a foundation that doubt cannot shake. When Zosima dies and his body begins to stink, Alyosha's faith is tested. He had expected a miracle, a sign of Zosima's holiness, and instead he gets the opposite, a humiliation. For a moment, he is shaken, tempted to agree with Ivan that the world is unjust and faith is foolish. But then he has his vision of Zosima at the wedding feast, and something settles in him. He realizes that true faith does not depend on miracles or signs. It is deeper than that, more resilient. It survives even when expectations are not met, when prayers seem unanswered, when the world appears to contradict what faith promises. After this crisis, Alyosha goes outside and falls to the earth, embracing it, kissing it, watering it with his tears. This is one of the most beautiful moments in all of Dostoevsky's work. Alyosha is experiencing what Zosima taught about, a direct sense of connection with all of creation, a joy that comes not from things going well, but from perceiving the holiness of existence itself. He is not happy because his problems have been solved or because he has received some comforting answer. He is happy because he has touched something real and eternal, something that suffering cannot destroy. This moment of ecstasy is Dostoevsky's testimony to what faith can be when it moves beyond belief in doctrines, to become a lived experience of love and connection. Dostoevsky knew that this kind of faith is rare and difficult to sustain. Most of the time, we live on the surface of things, caught up in our own dramas and desires, not touching the depths that Alyosha touches in that moment. But Dostoevsky believed that these moments of deeper awareness are available to everyone, that they represent our true nature, which is usually obscured by ego and fear. Faith is about remembering this true nature, about returning to it again and again, even when we forget. It is not something we achieve once and then possess forever. It is a constant practice, a continual turning back toward love when we have wandered away from it. The question that haunts Dostoevsky's work is whether this kind of faith is possible without belief in God. Can we maintain values like love and compassion and human dignity if we do not believe they reflect something ultimate about reality? Or do these values collapse into mere preference, cultural convention, once we remove the transcendent foundation? Ivan Karamazov says that if God does not exist, everything is permitted. Dostoevsky seems to agree with this on one level. Without God, without some absolute ground for morality, we are left with only power and preference. The strong can dominate the weak, and there is no cosmic justice to appeal to, no ultimate accountability. Each person must create their own values, and there is no way to say that one person's values are better than another's. But on another level, Dostoevsky suggests that the question of God's existence is less important than the question of how we live. Christ's teaching about love does not depend on metaphysical arguments about whether God exists. It is a teaching about how to be human, how to treat others, how to find meaning and purpose. Even if we cannot prove that God exists, we can still choose to live as if love matters, as if people have inherent worth, as if compassion is the right response to suffering. This is what Camus would later call philosophical suicide and reject. But Dostoevsky embraces it. He is saying that we must make a bet, must choose to live one way or another, and the choice to live according to love, even if we cannot rationally justify it, is the choice that makes life bearable and meaningful. So faith, in the end, is not about certainty or proof. It is about commitment. It is about deciding that love is real and important and worth devoting your life to, even if you have doubts, even if reason cannot establish it with finality. Dostoevsky's faith was hard-won and fragile, constantly under assault from doubt and suffering. But he clung to it because without it, life seemed unbearable. He saw the alternative in characters like Ivan and the underground man, people who cannot believe but also cannot live without believing, who are trapped in a hell of their own reasoning. And he saw the possibility of something better in characters like Zosima and Alyosha and Sonia, people who have chosen love despite everything, who have made the leap of faith and found that it carries them, that it gives them a peace and joy that transcends understanding. As these thoughts settle into your awareness, as you feel the weight and lightness of what Dostoevsky is offering, you might recognize that he is not asking you to believe anything in particular. He is not proselytizing or defending Orthodox Christianity in any simple sense. He is simply showing you different ways of being human, different responses to the fundamental questions of existence, and inviting you to consider which way seems most true, most life-giving, most worth pursuing. His own choice was for faith, but a faith that had looked honestly at all the reasons not to believe, and chosen to believe anyway. This is faith beyond reason, not because it is irrational, but because it addresses questions that reason alone cannot answer, questions about meaning and value and how to live that require more than logic to resolve. There is a thin line between psychological insight and madness in Dostoevsky's work, and many of his characters walk along that line, sometimes crossing over into territory where reason breaks down and consciousness fragments into multiple conflicting voices. Dostoevsky understood mental illness from the inside. His epilepsy, which began in his 20s and plagued him throughout his life, gave him experiences of altered consciousness that he both feared and valued. In the moments before a seizure, he would sometimes experience what he called a feeling of supreme harmony, a sense that everything was connected and meaningful, that life in all its fullness was compressed into a single luminous instant. Then the seizure would come, and he would lose consciousness, wake up hours later depleted and disoriented. These experiences gave him a direct understanding of how fragile our ordinary consciousness is, how easily it can be disrupted, how close we always are to states of being that seem utterly different from our normal waking awareness. This understanding shapes how he writes about his characters' internal lives. They are not stable, unified selves, but shifting collections of impulses, ideas, emotions, memories that sometimes cohere and sometimes fly apart. The underground man is perhaps the clearest example of this. He contains multitudes that contradict each other. He despises himself, but also thinks himself superior to everyone else. He wants connection, but pushes people away. He analyzes his own motives endlessly, but cannot act on his understanding. He is less a character than a battlefield where different aspects of consciousness war with each other. And this warfare is not presented as pathological, in a simple sense. It is presented as what human consciousness is actually like when we are honest about it, when we do not simplify ourselves into a neat, coherent narrative. In The Double, one of Dostoevsky's earlier works, this fragmentation becomes literal. The protagonist, Golyatkin, encounters his exact double, another man who looks just like him, has his name, begins taking over his life. The double represents everything that Golyatkin has repressed, all the ambition and aggression and social climbing that he cannot acknowledge in himself. The double acts out all the behaviors that Golyatkin secretly wants to enact, but cannot because he is too bound by propriety and fear. Gradually, the double displaces him, and Golyatkin descends into madness, unable to distinguish between himself and his double, unable to maintain the boundaries of his identity. The story can be read as a psychological breakdown, a dissociative episode where repressed aspects of the self emerge and take on independent existence. But it can also be read as a commentary on identity itself, on how unstable the sense of self is, how dependent on social recognition and validation, how easily it can dissolve when those external supports are removed. Raskolnikov in Crime and Punishment also experiences a kind of psychological fragmentation after his crime. He is not one person, but several people inhabiting the same body. There is the rational theorist who justified the murder. There is the terrified animal who barely escaped the scene. There is the person who feels genuine compassion for others and acts spontaneously to help them. There is the prideful man who wants to prove he is extraordinary. There is the guilt-ridden sinner who wants to confess and be punished. These different selves speak in different voices, pull him in different directions, and he cannot integrate them into a coherent whole. His consciousness becomes a chaos of contradictory impulses, and this chaos manifests as fever, delirium, strange behaviors that make no sense from the outside because they are coming from different internal fragments that are not in communication with each other. What Dostoevsky is showing is that guilt is not just a feeling but a force that tears consciousness apart. When we violate our own moral sense, when we do something that we know is wrong, we create a split in ourselves. Part of us tries to justify what we did, to maintain the narrative that we are good people who had good reasons. But another part knows the truth, knows that we have transgressed, and that part will not be silent. This creates an internal civil war that can lead to psychological breakdown. Raskolnikov tries to maintain his theory, to convince himself that he was right to kill, but his conscience will not accept this. The guilt gnaws at him from within, manifesting as physical illness, paranoia, inability to function. He cannot escape himself. Wherever he goes, he carries the knowledge of what he has done, and this knowledge poisons everything. The character of Ivan Karamazov takes this even further. Ivan's breakdown is not caused by something he did directly, but by the implications of his own ideas. He has argued that if there is no God, everything is permitted. He has rejected moral absolutes, claimed that there is no objective basis for morality, and then Smerdyakov acts on these ideas and murders their father. Ivan is not directly responsible, did not plan the murder, did not encourage it explicitly, but he cannot escape the feeling that he is guilty nonetheless. His ideas created the conditions in which the murder became possible. He is morally complicit even if he is not legally guilty, and this realization shatters him. He begins to hallucinate, to argue with a devil who may be real or may be a projection of his own tortured psyche. The devil that visits Ivan is a brilliant creation, one of Dostoevsky's greatest achievements. He appears as a shabby gentleman, a parasite, someone who has seen better days. He is articulate and clever, but there is something pathetic about him. He represents the voice of nihilism, the internal voice that mocks all ideals, that reduces everything to self-interest and power, that cannot believe in anything transcendent. And he torments Ivan by reflecting back to him his own worst thoughts, by showing him the logical conclusions of his own philosophy. The devil tells Ivan that he suffers because he cannot resolve the contradiction in his own thinking. He wants to believe in good and evil, but he has rejected the foundation that makes good and evil meaningful. He wants morality without God, but the devil shows him that this is impossible. Without an absolute foundation, morality collapses into mere preference and power. What makes this scene so unsettling is that we cannot be sure whether the devil is real or a hallucination. Dostoevsky deliberately leaves this ambiguous. In one sense, the The devil is clearly Ivan's own thoughts made manifest, the voice of his unconscious speaking back to him. But in another sense, the devil seems to have knowledge that Ivan does not, seems to be an independent entity. This ambiguity is not a flaw, but the point. Dostoevsky is suggesting that the distinction between internal and external, between self and other, is not as clear as we like to think. Our inner voices may be more than just our own thoughts. They may tap into something larger, darker, forces that exist beyond individual consciousness. The devil is both Ivan's shadow and something more, both a psychological projection and a metaphysical reality. Ivan's madness is different from Raskolnikov's. Raskolnikov goes mad because of what he has done, because he has violated his own moral sense and cannot integrate that violation. But Ivan goes mad because of what he thinks, because his ideas have led to consequences he did not intend and cannot accept. He is destroyed by the weight of his own intelligence, by following logic to its conclusions and finding those conclusions unbearable. This is the danger of consciousness that Dostoevsky keeps returning to. Thinking too much, analyzing too deeply, refusing to accept any limit on rational inquiry. This can lead to breakdown rather than enlightenment. There are truths that we cannot bear to know, contradictions that we cannot resolve, and sometimes the healthiest response is not to push further but to accept mystery, to surrender the demand for complete understanding. The character of Stavrogin in Demons represents another form of madness, perhaps the most disturbing in all of Dostoevsky's work. Stavrogin is a nobleman who has become completely hollow inside. He has no convictions, no passions, no sense of meaning or purpose. He has tried everything, experienced everything, and none of it has touched him. He is capable of terrible acts, including the possible rape of a child, but these acts mean nothing to him. He performs them almost experimentally to see if he can feel something, if he can break through the numbness that encases him, but nothing works. He remains dead inside, a beautiful shell with nothing at the center. This is spiritual death, the complete absence of soul. And it is more terrifying than any act of evil because it cannot be reached or redeemed. Evil at least represents a kind of passion, a misdirected energy that might be turned toward good. But Stavrogin's emptiness cannot be redirected because there is nothing there to redirect. Stavrogin represents what Dostoevsky feared most, the possibility that nihilism could become not just an intellectual position but a lived reality, a state of being where nothing matters and everything is equally meaningless. He is what Ivan might become if Ivan's rationalism completed its work, destroying not just belief in God but all capacity for feeling and connection. Stavrogin has followed the path of absolute freedom to its end and found nothing there. He has transgressed all boundaries, refused all moral limits, asserted his will against everything, and it has left him completely empty. He ends up hanging himself, not out of despair exactly, but out of a kind of boredom, a sense that there is nothing left to do, no experience left to try. His suicide is not a tragic act but a flat statement of fact. Life has no meaning, therefore why continue? There is no passion in it, no drama, just a cold, logical conclusion. What Dostoevsky is showing through these various forms of madness and psychological breakdown is that consciousness without foundation, without faith or love or connection to something beyond itself, cannot sustain itself. It collapses under its own weight. The underground man becomes paralyzed by his own self-consciousness. Raskolnikov is torn apart by guilt. Ivan is destroyed by the implications of his own ideas. Stavrogin becomes a hollow shell. These are not just individual tragedies, but warnings about the direction that modern consciousness is heading. As traditional sources of meaning and value erode, as belief in God and absolute morality becomes untenable for many people, what will replace these foundational structures? Can we build meaning on purely human foundations, or will we fall into various forms of madness as the weight of freedom and responsibility without transcendent support becomes unbearable? Dostoevsky does not claim to have complete answers to these questions, but he shows clearly what does not work. Isolation does not work. The attempt to be self-sufficient, to need nothing and no one, leads to the underground man's misery. Pure rationalism does not work. The attempt to understand everything through reason alone leads to Ivan's breakdown. Absolute freedom does not work. The rejection of all limits and moral boundaries leads to Stavrogin's emptiness. What does work, or at least what offers hope, is connection with others, love that is not based on rational calculation, faith in something beyond the self even if that faith cannot be proven. The characters who maintain sanity and peace in Dostoevsky's world are those who have found ways to connect, to love, to serve something larger than themselves. Sonia maintains her sanity despite terrible circumstances because she has faith and because she is connected to her family, willing to sacrifice herself for them. Zosima maintains peace because he has surrendered his ego, accepted his place in the larger whole of creation, devoted himself to serving others. Alyosha is sent back into the world after his spiritual crisis with instructions to love actively, to engage with others, to be present to suffering without being destroyed by it. These characters represent different versions of the same basic insight, that meaning and mental health come not from the self turned in on itself, but from the self in relationship, the self that has found something or someone to devote itself to beyond its own narrow interests. The search for meaning that drives so many of Dostoevsky's characters is ultimately a search for how to live when traditional sources of meaning have become questionable. This is the modern predicament, the situation that Nietzsche would later describe as the death of God. Dostoevsky is exploring what happens to individuals and societies when the transcendent foundation is removed or called into question. Some people, like Ivan, cannot make the adjustment and break down. Others, like Stavrogin, embrace nihilism and are destroyed by it. Still others, like the underground man, become trapped in endless self-conscious spirals that go nowhere. But a few, like Alyosha and Sonia, find a way to maintain meaning and connection despite the loss of certainty, despite the inability to prove that their faith and values are objectively grounded. They make a leap, a bet, a commitment, and that commitment gives them something to stand on, even when the ground seems to be dissolving beneath everyone else. As we sit with these portraits of madness and breakdown, as we let ourselves feel the fragility of consciousness and the difficulty of maintaining sanity in a world that no longer provides clear answers, we might recognize aspects of our own struggles in these characters. Most of us do not descend into full madness, but we know what it is to feel fragmented, to contain contradictions that we cannot resolve, to struggle with guilt or doubt, or the sense that nothing really matters. Dostoevsky is showing us that these struggles are not signs of individual weakness, but responses to real problems, genuine difficulties that everyone must face. The question is how we respond. Do we isolate ourselves like the underground man? Do we try to reason our way to certainty like Ivan? Do we embrace nihilism like Stavrogin? Or do we find a way, however imperfect and uncertain, to connect, to love, to commit ourselves to something beyond ourselves? These are the choices that determine not just whether we go mad, but what kind of people we become. Freedom is the central paradox of human existence for Dostoevsky. We are condemned to be free, as Sartre would later put it, echoing a theme that Dostoevsky explored decades earlier. We cannot not choose. Even refusing to choose is itself a choice. And with this freedom comes a weight that many people find unbearable. The underground man, ranting against the rationalists who think human beings can be predicted like mathematical equations, insists that people will sometimes choose against their own interest just to prove they are free, just to assert that they are not mere mechanisms following deterministic laws. This might seem perverse, but it captures something real about human nature. We would rather suffer as free beings than be comfortable as automatons. Freedom is more precious to us than happiness, even though freedom is also terrifying. The terror of freedom comes from responsibility. If we are truly free, if our choices are not determined by our genes or our environment or our upbringing or any other external force, then we are fully responsible for what we choose. We cannot blame anyone or anything else. We cannot say that circumstances forced us to act as we did. We made a choice, and the consequences of that choice belong to us. This is an enormous burden, and much of human behavior can be understood as an attempt to escape this burden, to deny our freedom so that we do not have to bear the weight of responsibility. We tell ourselves that we had no choice, that anyone in our situation would have done the same, that we are victims of forces beyond our control. And sometimes this is true, but often it is a lie we tell ourselves to avoid facing the fact that we chose badly and must live with the consequences. Raskolnikov's journey in Crime and Punishment is fundamentally about coming to terms with freedom and responsibility. Before the murder, he constructs an elaborate theory that will allow him to kill without feeling guilty. He tells himself that certain extraordinary people are beyond conventional morality, that they have the right to transgress for the greater good. This theory is an attempt to escape responsibility, to make his choice not really a choice, but an inevitability that follows from his status as an extraordinary person. If he is Napoleon, if he is one of the elect who shape history, then killing the pawnbroker is not murder, but a necessary act that any other extraordinary person in his position would also perform. He is not choosing so much as fulfilling his nature, but as soon as he commits the act, this elaborate structure of justification collapses. He discovers that he cannot escape responsibility through theory. He has chosen to kill, and that choice cannot be explained away, or justified, or made into anything other than what it is. The guilt that overtakes him is the voice of his own conscience, insisting that he is responsible, that he cannot hide from what he has done. And his suffering is his freedom reasserting itself, his authentic self rejecting the lie he told himself. The path to redemption, long and painful, involves accepting full responsibility for his choice. He must confess, must name what he did as murder, must accept punishment. Only by fully owning his choice and its consequences can he begin to move beyond it. The same pattern appears in the brothers Karamazov with Ivan. Ivan thinks he can believe that everything is permitted without this belief having consequences. He thinks ideas exist in a separate realm from actions, that what he thinks does not affect what he does or what others do. But then Smerdyakov murders their father, explicitly citing Ivan's ideas as permission and justification. Ivan is horrified. He did not want his father dead. He did not intend for anyone to act on his philosophical speculations. But Smerdyakov shows him that ideas are not innocent, that what we believe shapes how we act and how others act, that we are responsible not just for our direct actions, but also for the consequences of the ideas we spread. Ivan cannot escape this responsibility by saying he did not intend for anyone to take him seriously. The ideas are out there, and they have effects, and he must take ownership of those effects. This raises profound questions about moral responsibility. How far does our responsibility extend? Are we responsible only for our direct intentional actions? Or are we also responsible for the unintended consequences of our actions, for the effects of our words and ideas, for the ways our choices ripple out and affect others in ways we cannot foresee or control? Dostoevsky seems to be pushing toward a very expansive view of responsibility. Zosima teaches that everyone is responsible for everyone, that we are all guilty for all. This sounds extreme, perhaps even absurd. How can I be responsible for crimes committed by people I have never met, for suffering in parts of the world I will never see? But Zosima is pointing to our fundamental interconnectedness. Everything we do affects others. Every choice we make sends ripples out into the world. We are part of a web of relationships and consequences that extends far beyond what we can see or understand. And to be fully human, to be fully conscious of what we are, requires accepting this vast responsibility. This does not mean that we are equally guilty for everything that happens in the world. There are degrees of responsibility. Direct action carries more responsibility than indirect influence. Intentional harm is worse than unintended harm. Dostoevsky is not collapsing all distinctions, but he is saying that none of us can claim to be entirely innocent, that we are all implicated in the suffering and evil of the world in ways large and small, and that recognizing this should make us humble rather than judgmental. When we see others committing sins or crimes, we should see ourselves in them, recognize that we too are capable of similar acts, that the difference between us and them is often smaller than we want to believe. This recognition leads to compassion rather than condemnation, to the desire to help rather than to punish. The paradox that Dostoevsky explores is that true freedom comes through surrender. This seems contradictory. How can we be free if we surrender? But he is pointing to a deeper truth. The person who clings to absolute autonomy, who refuses all limits, who will not submit to anything beyond their own will, becomes a slave to their own ego. They are constantly defending themselves, constantly asserting themselves against others, constantly proving that they are free. And this constant assertion of freedom actually imprisons them. They cannot rest, cannot connect with others authentically, cannot experience the peace that comes from accepting their place in a larger order. True freedom, Dostoevsky suggests, comes when we surrender the need to control everything, when we accept our dependence on others, when we submit to something larger than ourselves, whether that is God or love or moral truth or the human community. This is what Raskolnikov discovers. As long as he tries to maintain his pride, to prove that he was right to kill, to assert his status as an extraordinary person beyond conventional morality, he remains trapped in psychological torment. But when he finally surrenders, when he confesses and accepts punishment, when he allows Sonia's love to reach him, he begins to experience a kind of freedom that his previous assertion of autonomy never provided. He is free to be human again, free to feel, free to connect. The prison camp in Siberia is paradoxically the place where he begins to become truly free, because he has finally stopped running from the truth about himself. Similarly, Ivan is imprisoned by his own intellect, trapped in the contradictions of his own thinking. He wants to be free from God, free from moral absolutes, free to think whatever he wants without limit. But this supposed freedom leads to breakdown and madness. He is not liberated by his atheistic rationalism, but destroyed by it. Only when he breaks down completely, only when his proud intellect is shattered, does the possibility of healing emerge. He has to surrender his claim to understand everything, to have everything figured out, to be in control of his own consciousness. He has to accept that he does not know, that he cannot know, that he must live with mystery and ambiguity rather than certainty. The character who best exemplifies healthy freedom is Alyosha. He has submitted himself to Zosima's teaching, has accepted the discipline of the monastery, has surrendered his will to God, and yet he is more free than any other character in the novel. He can move through the world without defensiveness or anxiety. He can love without calculation. He can respond to situations spontaneously without getting trapped in endless self-conscious deliberation. His surrender has not made him a slave, but has liberated him to be fully himself. He has found his freedom by accepting limits, by recognizing that he is not the center of the universe, by devoting himself to something beyond his own ego. This is a deeply counterintuitive understanding of freedom, especially in modern Western culture, where freedom is often understood as the absence of all constraints, the ability to do whatever we want without anyone telling us no. But Dostoevsky is showing that this kind of absolute freedom is an illusion that leads to despair. Real freedom requires structure, requires limits, requires submission to something that gives our choices meaning and direction. A musician is not free to play beautiful music until they have submitted to the discipline of learning their instrument, practicing scales, mastering technique. That discipline does not limit their freedom, but makes their freedom possible. Similarly, moral and spiritual discipline does not limit our freedom to be human, but makes that freedom possible. Without it, we are like people trying to play music without ever having learned an instrument. We can make noise, but we cannot create meaning. The weight of choice, then, is not something to be escaped, but something to be embraced. Yes, it is heavy. Yes, it is sometimes unbearable. Yes, we will make mistakes and have to live with the consequences. But this weight is the price of being human, of being conscious, of being capable of love and meaning and purpose. The alternative is either the determinism that denies we have real choices at all, or the nihilism that says our choices do not matter because nothing matters. Both of these paths lead to a kind of death, a shutting down of what is most alive in us. Dostoevsky is saying that we must accept the weight, must bear the responsibility, must live with the knowledge that our choices shape not just our own lives, but the lives of countless others in ways we cannot fully control or predict. And yet, having accepted this weight, we must also accept that we will fail, that we will choose wrongly, that we will hurt ourselves and others despite our best intentions. This is where forgiveness becomes essential, not forgiveness as a way of escaping responsibility, but forgiveness as a way of continuing to live with ourselves and others despite our failures. Dostoevsky's characters, who find peace, are those who have learned both to take responsibility for their choices and to accept forgiveness when they fail. Raskolnikov must confess and accept punishment, fully owning what he has done, but he must also accept Sonia's love and forgiveness, must allow himself to be resurrected into life again despite his crime. The two movements are inseparable. Responsibility without forgiveness leads to despair. Forgiveness without responsibility is cheap grace that changes nothing. But together, they create the possibility of genuine transformation. This is what Dostoevsky means when he speaks of redemption. It is not a magical erasure of the past, not a forgetting of what was done. Raskolnikov will always carry the knowledge that he murdered two people. That cannot be undone, but it can be integrated, can become part of a larger story of death and rebirth, can be transformed from a final condemnation into a chapter in a longer journey. The weight of his choice remains, but it no longer crushes him. He has found a way to carry it, to live with it, to allow it to teach him compassion and humility rather than simply destroying him. This is the paradoxical alchemy that suffering can work when we meet it honestly and remain open to love. The very thing that should destroy us becomes, somehow, the foundation of a deeper and more authentic life. The moral framework that emerges from Dostoevsky's exploration of freedom and responsibility is not based on rules or commandments, but on conscience and compassion. He is deeply suspicious of ethical systems that reduce morality to a set of regulations that can be followed mechanically. The Pharisee who keeps all the rules but has no compassion is further from true morality than the prostitute who breaks the rules but loves deeply. What matters is not external conformity to a code, but the inner quality of soul, the capacity to feel others' suffering as one's own, the willingness to take responsibility not just for one's own actions, but for the well-being of all. This is a demanding vision of morality, far more demanding than simply following rules, because it requires constant attention to the particular situation, constant openness to the other person, constant willingness to sacrifice one's own interests for the sake of love. This is why Dostoevsky's Christ figure in the brothers Karamazov does not speak. Words, arguments, rules, justifications, all of these belong to the realm of the Grand Inquisitor, to systems of control and power. Christ's response is simply to be present, to listen, to love. The kiss he gives the Inquisitor contains more truth than any speech could convey. It says, "I see you, I understand you, I love you even as you reject me. I will not force you to accept my love, but I offer it freely." This is the essence of moral action for Dostoevsky, not following rules or making calculations about consequences, but responding to each person and situation with attention and love, allowing our actions to flow from our deepest sense of connection rather than from external obligations or internal theorizing. But this vision raises a difficult question. If morality is not based on rules and calculations, if it is about spontaneous, compassionate response to particular situations, then how do we know we are doing the right thing? How do we distinguish between genuine compassion and mere sentiment? How do we avoid simply doing whatever feels good in the moment? Dostoevsky does not provide a systematic answer to these questions because he believes that morality cannot be systematized. We must cultivate our conscience, our capacity to perceive what love requires in each situation. This is the work of a lifetime, the constant practice of paying attention to ourselves and others, of examining our motives, of remaining humble about our own capacity for self-deception. We will make mistakes. We will often get it wrong. But if we remain committed to the practice of love, if we are willing to be corrected by reality and by others, if we do not harden our hearts or close ourselves off in defensive pride, then gradually we can develop the kind of wisdom that knows how to act rightly without needing a rule book. So Seema's teaching about asking forgiveness of everyone and everything points toward this kind of moral consciousness. When we recognize that we are connected to all of existence, when we feel our responsibility extending outward to encompass not just our immediate circle but all beings, then our actions naturally become more careful, more considerate, more loving. We cannot treat others as means to our ends because we see them as part of ourselves. We cannot destroy nature carelessly because we feel our kinship with all living things. This is not a morality based on duty or fear of punishment, but a morality that flows naturally from expanded consciousness, from seeing truly how things are. And Dostoevsky believed that this kind of consciousness is available to everyone, that it represents our deepest nature, which is usually obscured by ego and fear, but which can be recovered through spiritual practice and openness to love. The weight of choice, then, is not ultimately a burden to be endured, but a gift to be embraced. It is what makes us human, rather than animals or machines. It is what gives our lives meaning and significance. Without the possibility of genuine choice, without real freedom and real responsibility, we would be merely passive observers of a predetermined script, and nothing we did would matter. But because we are free, because our choices actually shape reality, because we are responsible for creating the world we inhabit together, every moment carries enormous weight and importance. How we treat the person in front of us right now matters. What we choose to value and pursue matters. How we respond to suffering matters. Not because there is some cosmic scorekeeper tallying up our good and bad deeds, but because these choices actually create reality, actually determine what kind of world we live in, actually shape who we become and who others become through their interactions with us. This understanding of freedom and responsibility is both terrifying and exhilarating. It places enormous demands on us, asks us to take ownership of our lives in a way that is uncomfortable and often painful. But it also gives us agency, gives us dignity, gives us the sense that we are participants in the creation of meaning rather than passive recipients of predetermined fate. And Dostoevsky believed that this is what human beings need most, not comfort or security or pleasure, but meaning, purpose, the sense that our lives matter and that what we do makes a difference. Even if pursuing meaning requires suffering, even if accepting responsibility is painful, even if freedom is terrifying, we would choose these things over a comfortable slavery because they are what make us fully alive, fully human, fully ourselves. As these reflections on freedom and choice settle into your awareness, as you feel the weight and the wonder of it, you might notice how your own experience of choice shifts slightly. Every decision, even the small ones, carries significance. Every interaction with another person is an opportunity to create meaning through love, or to diminish meaning through indifference or cruelty. This is not a cause for anxiety or for becoming paralyzed by the magnitude of it all. Rather, it is an invitation to live more consciously, more deliberately, more attentively to what each moment is asking of us. And it is also an invitation to be gentle with ourselves when we fail, as we inevitably will, because failure is part of the process, part of the learning, part of what makes us capable of genuine compassion for others who also struggle and fail and try again. We have traveled through many dark territories in this long meditation on Dostoevsky's philosophy. We have descended into the underground of consciousness with the underground man, felt his paralysis and resentment. We have walked with Raskolnikov through his crime and into the terrible suffering of guilt, following him slowly toward the possibility of redemption. We have sat with Ivan Karamazov as he built his intellectual case against God, felt the force of his rebellion against innocent suffering. We have witnessed the psychological breakdowns that come when consciousness becomes unbearable, when freedom reveals itself as a burden too heavy to carry alone. We have confronted the problem of evil, the mystery of suffering, the terror of absolute responsibility. And through it all, we have seen how Dostoevsky refused to look away from the darkness, refused to offer easy consolations, refuse to pretend that life is simpler or gentler than it actually is. But now, at the end of this journey, it is important to recognize that Dostoevsky's darkness was never the final word. He descended into hell not because he loved darkness, but because he believed that only by fully acknowledging the darkness could we find authentic light. He was not a nihilist or a pessimist, despite what a superficial reading might suggest. He was, rather, a man who insisted on hope that had earned the right to call itself hope by first passing through despair. His faith was not naive optimism that ignored suffering, but a faith that had looked suffering directly in the face and chosen to believe in love anyway. This is what makes his vision so powerful and so necessary, especially for those of us living in times when traditional sources of meaning and certainty have eroded, when we can no longer believe in the easy answers, but still need something to live by. The light that emerges in Dostoevsky's work is found in moments of genuine human connection, in acts of spontaneous compassion, in the choice to love when there is no rational reason to do so. Raskolnikov, broken and suffering in Siberia, finally opening himself to Sonya's love and feeling something like hope for the first time since the murder. Alyosha falling to the earth and embracing it, weeping with joy at the beauty and holiness of existence despite all its suffering. The boys gathered at Ilyusha's funeral, promising to remember this moment and to carry their love for each other throughout their lives. These moments are brief, fragile, easily overlooked. They do not resolve the philosophical problems or make the suffering disappear, but they represent something real and precious, something that makes life worth living despite everything. What all of these moments have in common is that they involve a kind of surrender, a letting go of the ego's demand to control and understand everything. Raskolnikov must surrender his pride, his theory, his attempt to place himself above others. Ivan must surrender his intellectual certainty, his demand that the world make sense according to his moral categories. The underground man, tragically, cannot surrender, and so he remains trapped. But those who can let go, who can accept their need for others, who can open themselves to love, even at the risk of being hurt, these are the ones who find peace. Not a permanent peace, not a final resolution, but moments of peace that are enough to make the struggle worthwhile, enough to justify continuing, enough to suggest that life is not meaningless, even when we cannot prove its meaning. Dostoevsky's vision of redemption is not religious in any conventional sense. He was Orthodox Christian, certainly, and his faith shaped his thinking profoundly. But the redemption he writes about does not require belief in specific doctrines or adherence to particular religious practices. It is available to anyone who can find the courage to face themselves honestly, to take responsibility for their choices, to remain open to love despite all the reasons to close down and protect themselves. Sonya is forced into prostitution and lives in conditions that would destroy most people's faith, yet she maintains her connection to God and to compassion. She represents the possibility that even in the worst circumstances, even in the deepest degradation, the human spirit can persist, can find something to hold on to, can choose love over despair. This choice of love is not presented as easy or obvious. It is a wager, a gamble made when all the evidence seems to point the other way. When Ivan catalogues the suffering of children, when he shows how innocent people endure terrible pain for no reason, the rational response might be to conclude that the universe is cruel or indifferent, that God either does not exist or does not deserve worship. But Dostoevsky, through characters like Zosima and Alyosha, suggests another response: to acknowledge all of that suffering, to feel its full weight, and then to choose compassion anyway. Not because compassion makes sense or can be justified through philosophical argument, but because compassion is what we are meant to be when we are most truly ourselves. The choice of love is the choice to be human rather than to be a mere calculating intellect or a bundle of appetites. It is the choice to affirm that existence has value, that people matter, that kindness and beauty and connection are real and important even if they cannot be proven or explained. Zosima's teaching represents Dostoevsky's most direct statement of this affirmative vision. When Zosima says that life is paradise if only we would recognize it, he is not denying suffering or pretending everything is wonderful. He is pointing to a way of seeing that recognizes the sacred in ordinary existence, that finds beauty and meaning in simple things, that experiences gratitude for the gift of being alive despite all the difficulties. This way of seeing is not automatic or easy. It requires practice, requires cultivation, requires constant returning to it when we forget. But it is available, Dostoevsky insists. We can train ourselves to see with these eyes, to feel with this heart. And when we do, everything changes. Not the external circumstances necessarily, but our relationship to those circumstances, our capacity to find joy even in hardship, to maintain peace even in chaos. The image of Alyosha kissing the earth captures this perfectly. He has just been through a crisis of faith. His beloved teacher Zosima has died and his body has begun to stink, seemingly a sign that God has rejected him. Alyosha has felt the full force of doubt, has been tempted to agree with Ivan that the world is unjust and faith is foolish. But then he has his vision of Zosima at the wedding feast, and something breaks open in him. He goes outside and throws himself on the ground, kissing the earth, watering it with his tears of joy. He is not happy because his problems have been solved, or because he has received proof that God exists. He is happy because he has touched something real, has felt his connection to all of existence, has experienced the holiness that pervades everything if we have eyes to see it. This is the light beyond darkness, the joy that survives even after we have faced the worst, the affirmation of life that is more fundamental than any philosophical argument for or against existence. What Dostoevsky understood, and what he tried to show through his novels, is that human beings need meaning more than they need happiness. We can endure tremendous suffering if we believe it serves some purpose, if we sense that our lives matter, if we feel connected to something larger than ourselves. But we cannot endure meaninglessness. We cannot bear the sense that our existence is random and purposeless, that nothing we do makes any real difference, that we are alone in an indifferent universe. This is why characters like Ivan and the Underground Man suffer so terribly, even though their material circumstances are not the worst. They have lost the sense of meaning, have cut themselves off from sources of purpose and connection. And this spiritual suffering is worse than any physical deprivation. The path back to meaning, as Dostoevsky maps it, runs through suffering that is accepted rather than resisted, through confession that faces truth rather than hiding from it, through love that is given without calculation or guarantee of return. These are demanding requirements, and not everyone can meet them. Some people, like Stavrogin in Demons, are too far gone, too hollowed out to recover. Some, like the Underground Man, are too trapped in their own consciousness to break free. But many others, like Raskolnikov and perhaps even Ivan eventually, can find their way through the darkness to something like light. The process is slow and painful. There are no shortcuts, no easy solutions, but the possibility exists, and that possibility is what sustains hope. Dostoevsky's legacy is this insistence on facing the hardest questions while maintaining hope, on descending into darkness while trusting that light exists, on acknowledging suffering while choosing love. His novels are difficult, sometimes overwhelming in their intensity and darkness, but they are ultimately life-affirming because they show that even after we have seen the worst, even after we have confronted all the reasons for despair, something remains that is worth affirming. The human capacity for love, for compassion, for moral sensitivity, for meaning-making, these things persist. They cannot be argued away through logic. They cannot be destroyed by suffering. They are woven into the fabric of what we are, and when we align ourselves with them, we find that we are not alone, that we are participating in something larger and more enduring than our individual lives. The final image to carry with us from this long exploration is that of light and darkness, not as opposites, but as interpenetrating realities. Dostoevsky did not believe we could have light without darkness, joy without sorrow, faith without doubt. These pairs are not enemies, but partners in the dance of existence. The light is more precious because we know the darkness. The joy is deeper because it has survived sorrow. The faith is stronger because it has wrestled with doubt and emerged intact. This is the wisdom that Dostoevsky offers us across the decades, speaking from his own hard-won experience of suffering and transformation. He is not telling us that life is easy or that everything works out well. He is telling us that life is hard, often brutally hard, but that even so, it contains moments of such beauty and meaning and connection that the struggle is worthwhile. As you prepare to drift into sleep, carrying these thoughts with you into the night, you might notice how Dostoevsky's vision offers a kind of companionship. He has been where you are, has felt what you feel, has struggled with the same questions that keep you awake at night. And he is saying, across the gulf of time, that it is possible to endure, possible to hope, possible to love, even when everything seems to argue against it. The path he maps is not easy, but it is authentic. It does not promise what it cannot deliver, does not offer false consolations, does not demand that you deny your own experience or your own doubts. It simply asks that you remain open, that you keep choosing love and meaning even when they seem irrational, that you trust in your deepest self rather than in the arguments of consciousness cut off from life. His characters have walked through hell so that we might see both the reality of hell and the possibility of something beyond it. They have suffered so that we might understand suffering better, might know we are not alone in our struggles, might find courage to face our own darkness. They have sought redemption so that we might believe redemption is possible, not as an external reward, but as an internal transformation, a slow, patient work of becoming more fully ourselves, by becoming more fully human, which means more fully capable of love. This is the gift that Dostoevsky offers us, this vision of human existence that includes all the darkness, but is not finally defined by darkness, that acknowledges all the suffering, but finds something that survives suffering, that faces all the reasons for despair, but maintains hope nonetheless. And so we come to the end of this journey through Dostoevsky's thought, this long meditation on suffering and freedom, guilt and redemption, doubt and faith. We have traveled through the underground of consciousness, through the aftermath of crime, through the arguments against God, through the breakdown of reason, through the terror of responsibility. And we have found, at the end of it all, that life persists, that love remains possible, that meaning can be created even in a world that often seems meaningless. This is not a comfortable conclusion, not a tidy resolution that answers all questions, but it is an honest conclusion, one that honors the full complexity of human existence while refusing to surrender to nihilism or despair. Dostoevsky's philosophy, if we can call it that, is not a system, but a sensibility, a way of holding the tensions and contradictions of existence without needing to resolve them prematurely. It is a way of living that accepts suffering as inevitable, but refuses to let suffering have the last word. It is a faith that has looked honestly at all the reasons not to believe and has chosen belief anyway, not as an intellectual position, but as a commitment to live as if love and meaning are real, even when they cannot be proven. And it is an invitation to each of us to make that same choice, to walk that same difficult path, to find our own way through darkness to light. The morning will come, as it always does, bringing with it new choices and new challenges. The questions that Dostoevsky raised will still be there, will still be difficult, will still require our best efforts to address. But perhaps, having spent this time with his ideas, having walked with his characters through their struggles, having felt the depth of his vision, you will face those questions with a bit more courage, a bit more compassion, a bit more willingness to stay open to love, even when love seems impossible. Perhaps you will remember that you are not alone in your struggles, that countless others have walked this path before you, that the very difficulty of existence is what makes it precious and meaningful. And as you drift into sleep, remember, Dostoevsky's darkness was only ever a path to light. The suffering he portrayed so vividly was never an end in itself, but a crucible in which something precious could be refined. The questions he raised were not meant to destroy faith, but to purify it, to strip away everything false until only what is real remains. And what remains, after everything else has been burned away, is the simplest and most profound truth: that we are here, that we are alive, that we are capable of love, and that this is enough, more than enough. It is everything. Sleep well, knowing that the darkness you carry is not separate from your light, but part of the same mysterious gift of existence. Sleep well, trusting that meaning persists even when you cannot see it clearly. Sleep well, remembering that you are connected to all beings through cords of love that suffering cannot sever. And when you wake, may you carry with you some small portion of Dostoevsky's hard-won wisdom, that through pain we remember we are alive, through forgiveness we become divine, and through love we find our way home to ourselves and to each other, again and again, as many times as it takes, for as long as it takes, until the very end. And as consciousness begins to soften at the edges, as thought gives way to the deeper currents of rest, let yourself settle into the quiet understanding that has been emerging throughout this long exploration. Dostoevsky's voice, speaking across more than a century, has been tracing the contours of what it means to be human in all its difficulty and beauty. His characters live and suffer and seek, and in their seeking, they become mirrors in which we recognize ourselves. Their struggles are our struggles. Their questions are our questions. And their slow, uncertain movement towards something like grace suggests that we too might find our way, might stumble through our own darkness toward our own moments of light. There is something profoundly restful in this recognition, something that allows the anxious striving of the conscious mind to finally quiet down. We do not need to have everything figured out tonight. We do not need to resolve the contradictions or answer the unanswerable questions. We can simply be here, in this moment, breathing, existing, participating in the great mystery of consciousness that Dostoevsky spent his life exploring. The underground man taught us that too much thinking can paralyze us, that consciousness can become its own trap. But he also showed us, inadvertently, what we need. Not less consciousness, but a different relationship to consciousness. One that allows thought to serve life rather than replacing it. As sleep approaches, the boundaries between self and world begin to dissolve in that gentle way they do each night. The sharp distinctions that seemed so important during the day soften and blur. And perhaps this twilight state between waking and sleeping offers its own kind of wisdom, its own answer to Dostoevsky's questions. In sleep, we surrender control. We let go of the ego's constant need to manage and understand and justify. We trust in something larger than ourselves, something that will carry us through the night and return us to morning. This daily practice of surrender, so natural that we barely notice it, contains within it the pattern of the larger surrender that Dostoevsky writes about. The surrender of pride, of the illusion of self-sufficiency, of the demand that life conform to our expectations. Think of Raskolnikov, unable to sleep for so long after his crime, tormented by fever and guilt. His insomnia was the mark of his separation from life, his attempt to remain in control even after he had lost all control. Only when he finally confessed, finally accepted his need for others, for Sonia's love and for whatever grace might be available to him, only then could he begin to rest. The epilogue finds him in Siberia, and though his transformation is far from complete, he is at least sleeping again, at least beginning to rejoin the human community he had tried to transcend. Sleep itself becomes a metaphor for faith, for the willingness to let go into something unknown, trusting that we will be held, that we will wake again, that the darkness is not final. Ivan Karamazov, in his breakdown, loses the ability to distinguish between waking and sleeping, between real and hallucinated experience. His devil visits him in a state that might be dream, or might be madness, or might be something more mysterious still. The boundaries of consciousness break down when the mind is under too much strain, when it has pushed too far into regions it was not meant to explore alone. Ivan needed rest, needed to stop thinking, needed to surrender his demand for complete rational understanding. but he could not let go, and so his consciousness turned against him, fragmenting into voices that argued with each other, reflecting back to him his own unresolved contradictions. His suffering was the suffering of a mind that will not sleep, will not rest, will not accept its own limitations. But Alyosha knows how to rest, knows how to let go. After his crisis of faith, when Zosima dies, after his vision of the wedding feast, he falls asleep peacefully and wakes transformed. His sleep is healing because it is surrender, because it represents his willingness to trust something beyond his own understanding. He does not need to have all the answers. He does not need to defend his faith against every objection. He can simply rest in love, rest in his connection to others and to God and to the earth itself. And this rest renews him, gives him strength to return to the world, to engage with his brothers and with all the suffering people he will encounter. Rest is not escape from responsibility, but the foundation that makes sustained engagement possible. Zosima teaches that we should not be afraid of our sins, not because sins do not matter, but because God's love is greater than any sin. This might sound like cheap grace, like permission to do whatever we want without consequence. But Dostoevsky is careful to show that real repentance requires facing what we have done honestly, accepting full responsibility, being willing to suffer the consequences. The point is not that sins do not matter, but that they need not be the final word. That forgiveness is always available if we can humble ourselves to accept it. And accepting forgiveness requires a kind of rest, a letting go of the endless self-punishment and self-justification that keeps us trapped in the past. We must acknowledge what we did, learn from it, make amends where possible, and then release it, trusting that we are more than our worst actions. That transformation is possible, that the future is not simply a repetition of the past. This is deeply restful knowledge, even though it is demanding knowledge. It asks much of us, but it also offers much. It says that we do not have to carry everything alone, that we are held by love larger than ourselves, that our failures are not final, that each day offers new possibilities for becoming more fully who we are meant to be. And tonight, as sleep comes, we can practice this letting go, this surrender, this trust that when we release our grip on consciousness and control, we will not fall into nothingness, but will be carried through the darkness to morning. The characters Dostoevsky created live on, not just in books, but in some strange way in the imagination of everyone who has encountered them. Raskolnikov still walks the streets of Petersburg, tormented and seeking. Ivan still argues with his devil in the small hours of the morning. The underground man still rants in his shabby room, but also Sonia still loves with impossible compassion. Zosima still teaches about active love and cosmic responsibility. Alyosha still embraces the earth with tears of joy. These figures have become part of our collective consciousness, archetypal representatives of different ways of being human. And in encountering them, we encounter aspects of ourselves, parts that we have acknowledged and parts we have denied, potentials we have realized and potentials we have ignored. To spend time with Dostoevsky's ideas is to be changed by them, even if only slightly, even if only in ways we do not immediately recognize. His vision of human nature is so uncompromising, so honest, so willing to look at both the heights and depths of what we are capable of, that it expands our sense of what it means to be alive. He gives us permission to acknowledge our own darkness without being destroyed by it, to face our own doubts without losing faith entirely, to admit our own confusion without surrendering to nihilism. And he shows us, through characters who find their way through impossible situations, that transformation is always possible, that it is never too late to begin again, that even the most damaged soul can still choose love. As the night deepens and the mind continues its slow descent into sleep, the specific content of Dostoevsky's novels fades, but the feeling remains, the sense of having been in the presence of something true and important. The plots and characters and philosophical arguments blur together into a general impression of depth and seriousness and compassion. We carry with us not so much the details as the essence, the spirit of his vision. And this spirit whispers that life is hard but not hopeless, that suffering is real but not meaningless, that we are free but not alone, that love is possible even in the darkest places, especially in the darkest places, because that is where it is most needed and most precious. Think of all the people throughout history who have read Dostoevsky and found something they needed in his pages. The prisoners who saw themselves in Raskolnikov and found hope for redemption. The doubters who recognized their struggles in Ivan and felt less alone. The suffering people who met Sonia and learned that compassion could survive any degradation. The seekers who encountered Zosima and glimpsed a different way of being in the world. Dostoevsky has been a companion to millions of souls making their way through darkness, and he can be that for you too, if you let him. His voice, speaking from his own place of struggle and hard-won faith, says, "I have been where you are, I know what it costs, and I'm telling you it is worth it. The struggle is worth it, life is worth it, love is worth it, even when you cannot see why, even when everything seems to argue against it. Trust me, it is worth it." And with that assurance, that companionship across time, the last resistance to sleep dissolves. The questions can wait. The struggles can wait. For now, there is only this gradual softening, this gentle release, this falling into the restorative darkness that is not the darkness of despair, but the darkness of rest, the darkness that holds and heals and prepares us for morning. Dostoevsky's wisdom settles into the deep places of consciousness where words cannot reach, where it will do its quiet work of transformation while you sleep, where it will become part of how you see the world when you wake. The great themes have all been touched upon, explored, turned over, and examined from different angles. Suffering and its meaning, freedom and its weight, guilt and redemption, faith and doubt, the underground of consciousness, the possibility of love, the choice between despair and hope. And through it all, the consistent message that we are more than we think we are, capable of more than we believe, that our darkest moments can become doorways to our deepest transformation if we have the courage to walk through them rather than turning away. Let your breathing slow and deepen. Let your body sink more fully into rest. Let your mind release its grip on thoughts, allowing them to drift past like clouds, no longer trying to hold on to them or push them away. You are safe here in this moment, held by something larger than yourself. Something that Dostoevsky tried to point toward in all his writing, even though words can never quite capture it. The love that creates and sustains all things. The meaning that persists, even when we cannot articulate it. The light that shines in darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. Sleep is coming now. That merciful dissolution of the waking self, that return to the source from which we emerge each morning. And in sleep, you will process all that you have encountered tonight. All these ideas and images and stories, integrating them in ways that the conscious mind cannot achieve. When you wake, you may not remember specific details, may not be able to recount the argument or explain the philosophy. But something will have shifted. Something will be different. Some small seed will have been planted that will grow in its own time and its own way. Dostoevsky himself suffered from terrible insomnia at times, lying awake, haunted by his thoughts and his seizures and his anxieties. But he also knew moments of peace, moments when the struggle ceased and something like grace descended. He knew that we cannot earn peace through effort, cannot think our way to tranquility, cannot force resolution of the tensions that define human existence. We can only open ourselves to the possibility of peace, can only create the conditions that allow it to arrive as gift rather than achievement. And one of those conditions is surrender, the willingness to stop fighting, to accept our place in the larger order of things, to trust that we are held even when we cannot see by what or by whom. The philosophers and theologians will continue to argue about the problems Dostoevsky raised. They will write papers and books examining his treatment of faith and reason, his exploration of freedom and responsibility, his vision of redemption and transformation. And these arguments have their place, their value, their contribution, to human understanding. But beneath all the arguments, beneath all the analysis and interpretation, there is something simpler and more direct. There is the experience of reading his novels and feeling seen, feeling understood, feeling less alone in the struggle. There is the comfort of knowing that someone else has felt what you feel, has questioned what you question, has suffered as you have suffered, and has nevertheless found reasons to continue, to hope, to love. And that is what remains as sleep finally claims you, as consciousness gives way to dreams, as the night does its ancient work of healing and renewal. Not arguments or proofs or systematic philosophy, but simply the presence of another human being who looked unflinchingly at the hardest truths and did not turn away, who descended into the depths and returned to tell us what he found there, who walked through hell and brought back testimony that even there, even in the darkest places, love remains possible and life remains worth living. His voice fades now into silence as sleep deepens, but the echo of what he offered remains, a quiet assurance that you are not alone, that others have walked this path before you, that the darkness you fear is not the end, but only a passage, and that morning always comes, always, no matter how long the night. Rest now, let go, trust, sleep. And as you drift into sleep, remember, Dostoevsky's darkness was only ever a path to light.